Welcome to Blur, where stories come alive through sound. Carl Rolison's Marilyn Monroe, A Life of the Actress, offers a deeply insightful and balanced portrait of the legendary Hollywood star. In this revised and updated edition, Rolison goes beyond Monroe's glamorous public image to explore her as a serious, dedicated artist who constantly sought respect and authenticity in an industry that often reduced her to a stereotype. The biography traces Monroe's journey from her difficult childhood as Norma Jeane Mortenson through her transformation into one of the most famous actresses in the world. Rolison examines her early modeling days, her rise to stardom in the 1950s, and her struggle to gain creative control over her career. He highlights her determination to study acting at the Actors Studio, her collaborations with influential figures like Lee Strasberg, and her efforts to form Marilyn Monroe Productions, proving her ambition to be recognized as more than a sex symbol. Rolison also delves into Monroe's personal life, her marriages to Joe DiMaggio and Arthur Miller, her battles with loneliness, and her vulnerability beneath the surface of fame. The updated version includes fresh insights, newly available materials, and reflections on how Monroe's image continues to evolve in modern culture. Ultimately, Rolison portrays Monroe not just as a tragic figure, but as a pioneering actress whose intelligence, artistry, and emotional honesty reshaped the meaning of stardom. Acknowledgements. Several interviews were valuable owing to the insights Monroe's friends and business associates were able to supply concerning the shaping of the actress's life and attitude toward her art. Bruce Minix, my friend and professional colleague, helped to arrange the initial interviews with Ralph Roberts and Steffi Sidney, the daughter of Hollywood columnist Sidney Skalski. Sidney made a significant contribution to this biography by shrewdly commenting on an early draft and by questioning some of the facts included in other books on Monroe. Because her father was ailing and no longer able to grant interviews, she relayed a few of my questions to him. She also discussed her own perceptions of a Monroe, who delighted in carefully crafting her career in an almost conspiratorial way that included Skalski as her confidant. For example, when Ben Hecht had a draft of my story ready for Monroe to check, she read passages from it over the phone to Skalski, asking his opinion on how they sounded. Although Skalski wrote a great deal about the actress, he revealed very little about those things she confided to him in strictest confidence. As a result, even his daughter could not say for sure how much she believed in the stories her father and Monroe concocted together. And Monroe, precisely because she held on to parts of herself that were not for distribution, becomes a more complex figure. Ralph Roberts kindly reviewed what had been written about him in other sources and responded readily to questions about the actress's development of her talent. He conveyed a solid impression of Monroe's working life as an actress and of her fervent desire to educate herself. Our discussions of the method led him to recommend an interview with Ellen Burstyn, who generously shared with me her experience as a movie actress. She suggested ways in which Stanislavski would be particularly relevant to Monroe, and she helped to work out an approach to life and art partly based on our discussion of Audrey Flack's painting of Monroe. A long conversation with Audrey Flack suggested that what she had painted was what I wanted to write. For over 3 years, Flack was a constant source of support, corresponding with me regularly, commenting acknowledgments Roman 8 on drafts of the biography, and introducing it to friends and associates. My attention has shifted somewhat in this new edition of my biography, and I have deleted a section devoted to Flack's work, but its spirit continues to inspire what I write about Marilyn Monroe. Norman Roston consented to several interviews in person, on the phone, and by correspondence. He patiently responded to my pleas for advice and shrewdly assessed several chapters of this book. I am grateful, as well, to his wife, Hedda, who took the time to review her memories of Monroe, especially those concerning the prince and the showgirl. Rupert Allen's recollections of Monroe's career, early and late, have proved indispensable. Allen first knew Monroe in his capacity as a writer for Look. Then he worked as her press representative. Through it all, he remained her close friend. He checked several sections of my manuscript and answered numerous questions in person and on the phone. Stanley Flink, like Allen, first met Monroe when he was working as a writer, in Flink's case, for Life. As Richard Merriman suggested to me, Flink's memory of Monroe's early career remained vivid. The wit and enormous vitality she displayed during her first Hollywood years were still reflected in Flink's amusing stories. Merriman generously made available several hours of his tape-record Ed Life interview with Monroe. He wanted to demonstrate how easily one could get caught up in her style, in the incredible energy of her laugh. John Springer, the actress's press representative on the East Coast during the last 3 years of her life, was also very helpful in characterizing the kind of professional life Monroe pursued in New York. Like Merriman and Rupert Allen, he helped me get in touch with others who could confirm Monroe's intelligence as an artist. Susan Strasberg made astute comments on my manuscript that led to further revisions. She gave me a clearer sense of her mother's part in Monroe's preparations for the screen than can be found elsewhere. Susan Strasberg's father was not available for an interview, but Fred Giles supplied a tape recording of his sessions with Lee Strasberg, as well as other material that made a crucial difference in writing this biography. Both Giles and Morris Zolotow read my early drafts and answered many queries. Without them, several important leads would have been missed. Milton Green was available for a brief interview, and he clarified several points about the actress's working life and discussed her attitude toward my story. It was a flawed autobiography, she thought, but a sea-knowledge mens Roman 9 worth preserving. Almost everything she ever did, Green noted, was tinged with regret over not having been able to do it better. I came away from this encounter with Green impressed with his sober, and it seemed to me, subdued demeanor, which conveyed a sense that he still found it difficult to discuss his fruitful but fraught relationship with Monroe. Rose Steinberg Wapner yielded insights on Monroe's movie set behavior, and a short talk with Patricia Newcomb clarified aspects of the actress's professional plans in her last year. Newcomb was cordial but guarded, and I regret that I could not penetrate the barrier of her discretion. I also regret that several other important sources were not available to be interviewed. Joe Maggio's fierce refusal to deal with biographers of Monroe is legendary. He once walked out of the room when Fred Giles tried to put a question to him about her. I had a similar experience with Arthur Miller. I wrote to him asking for an interview. I did not receive a reply. At a reception for him at the University of Michigan, I introduced myself and said I was writing a biography of Monroe and would like to ask him some questions. He stared at me and said, "What is your question?" As I began to formulate one, a woman, book in hand, interrupted and asked him for his autograph. Miller turned toward her, his back to me, signaling the end of my interview. Later, I sent him my manuscript for comment. He replied that he had done with my work what he always did with material that did not include a stamped return envelope. He threw my book in the waste basket. As a result, I have had to make do with his by turns reticent and revealing autobiography, Time Bends. I want to express my appreciation to Gary Vitaco-Robles for sharing with me the manuscript of his forthcoming 2-volume biography of Marilyn Monroe, in which, at the last minute, I discovered those revealing notes by Joe DiMaggio that show how much he regretted treating her badly during their marriage, and how he vowed to make every effort to make amends. Several librarians were instrumental in finding obscure sources and suggesting fruitful areas of research. Mary Corliss in the film stills department of the Museum of Modern Art, Maxine Fleckner and her assistant Nancy Seeke at the Wisconsin Center for Film and Theater Research, Geraldine Ducklow in the theater collection of the Free Library of Philadelphia, and Nancy Goldman of the Pacific Film Archive. For their paw-tint and prompt handling of my requests, I wish to thank the staffs of Acknowledgements, the Los Angeles Police Department, and the city's district attorneys of FICE. The Theater Arts Library, University of California, Los Angeles. The Doheny Library, University of Southern California. The Margaret Herrick Library of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. The Amer Eichen Film Institute in Hollywood and Washington, D.C. The New York Public Library at Lincoln Center. The Library of Congress. The Columbus Public Library. The Cincinnati Public Library. And the Detroit Public Library. The Museum of Modern Art. Robert Rosen of the University of California, Los Angeles, the Library of Congress, and Films Incorporated all provided opportunities to screen Monroe's films. Although I was not able to visit the film and theater collection at the Humanities Research Center of the University of Texas at Austin, Edwin Neal kindly made available information on the library's considerable holdings of Monroe material. And Robert W. Daum and Paul M. Bailey arranged for a copy of Natasha Leidas's memoirs to be sent to me. And for advice about select ink photographs, I am indebted to David Wills. His book Marilyn Monroe/Metamorphosis is an incomparable collection of photographs. Jeff Mantor of the Larry Edmunds Bookshop, a wonderful supporter of the Hollywood Legend series, was also instrumental in providing important photographs. Several friends, relatives, and acquaintances were invaluable in keeping track of the enormous output of Monroe items. Bridget Al Len, George and Barbara Barnett, Judy Biscoff, Kristen Brady, Joanna Dutka, Avram Fenson, Mary Lee Field, Joan Fischella, Cyril Forbes, Ken and Geraldine Grunow, Mike Harmel, Charles Hart, Paul and Jean Hobben, Judy Hodge, Gloria House, Mary Hrabik-Samuel M. Thomas and G. David Jacobs, Ella Johnson, Julie Klein, Patty Mallon, Jim Mitchells, Betsy Olson, Paul Orlov, Lisa Paddock, Hope Palmer, Amy Perrone, Noel Palk, Bob Reinhard, Seymour Ricklin, Virginia Rock, Bernie Rogers, Betty Rollison, Bueller Rollison, Francis Saunders, Bet Savage, Rosalind Skindler, Vicky Siegel, Andy Silber, Hugh Stilley, June Taboroff, Brian Tremaine, Thomas Warcall, Rhea Wilmshurst, Saul Weinman, Pat and Bob Young, and Bill Zick. For their encouragement and advice, I thank T.H. Adamowski, Shay Earhart, Michael Daher, Susan Feinberg, Scott Feltman, Brad Field, Joe Gomez, Barry and Sandra Gross, Barbara Lounsbury, Penelope Majeski, Michael and Jane Milgate, David Saunders, and Pat Trickey, Bob Reinhard, Paul Orlov, David Jacobs, Joan Fischella, Jim Mitchells, Joe Gomez, Anthony Summers, and Joyce Engelson all made searching a C Knowledge Ments Roman 11 comments about various drafts of my biography. Some of the drafts were presented at the American Literature Symposium Roman II, University of Warsaw, 1980. A Popular Culture of the South Meeting, 1981. Joint Meetings of the Popular Culture and American Culture Associations, 1982, 1984. The Feminist Research in the 80s Conference at Northern Illinois University, 1982. A Midwest Modern Language Association Meeting, 1982. And a Modern Language Association Convention, 1983. Rhea Wilmshurst typed an early draft of the manuscript, and through careful editing, saved me from committing many embarrassing errors. I owe the biggest debt of all, however, to my wife, Dr. Lisa Paddock. Every page of this book reflects her precise editing. Every passage is richer because she helped me to imagine it. This page intentionally left blank. Chapter 1. Childhood, 1926 to 1938. On the Outside of the World, February 11, 1924, Gladys Pearl Baker married Martin E. Mortenson. She already had 2 children, then not living with her, by a previous marriage to John Newton Baker, from whom she was divorced. She was a quiet woman who worked as a film cutter at one of the Hollywood studios. Gladys kept to herself most of the time, and friends and family never seemed to have fathomed what went wrong in her second marriage to Mortenson, a union that lasted only 16 months. Although they were not divorced until June 1, 1927, Gladys left him 2 years earlier on May 25, 1925. When her daughter, Norma Jeane, was born on June 1, 1926, the birth certificate listed her last name as Mortenson, although Mortenson almost certainly was not her father. Gladys never told Norma Jeane who her father was, although the mother confided to her daughter a few things about him, including a story about his death in an auto accident that the child refused to believe. Many years later, when Norma Jeane became the starlet Marilyn Monroe, she said she learned that her father was Stanley Gifford, one of her mother's co-workers in the film industry. Gifford refused to acknowledge her efforts to contact him, and she took his rejection bitterly. It gave her one more reason to think of herself as a waif. Norma Jeane never had anything like a normal relationship with her mother. Just 12 days after her birth, Gladys took her daughter to Wayne and Ida Bolender's home in Hawthorne, California. The Bolenders were neighbors who would look after the baby for more than 6 years while Gladys worked. Gladys apparently doubted her capacity to handle a child full-time, because even when she was not working, she seemed more like an aloof visitor to the Bolender home than a mother childhood for who missed her child. She did not respond to her daughter's use of the word mama. Instead, As Monroe later recalled, her mother stared at her and gave no sign of affection. She did not even hold her daughter, and she barely spoke to the expectant little girl. On visits with Gladys, Norma Jeane was frightened and spent most of her time in the bedroom closet, hidden among her clothes. Gladys cautioned Norma Jeane not to make so much noise. It was as if the child were an intruder. Even the sound of Norma Jeane turning the pages of a book made her mother nervous. In sum, the child had few opportunities to behave in a free, spontaneous, and autonomous fashion. Norma Jeane looked for a way to fill the void in her visits with her mother. She noticed on the wall of Gladys's room a photograph of a rath-eared, jaunty-looking man with a lively smile and a Clark Gable mustache. And she was thrilled to learn from her mother that this robust figure was her father. No more was said about the photograph, but Norma Jeane dreamed about it constantly, probably because it exemplified the exuberance of spirit stilled in herself. Norma Jeane spent several months with an English couple, movie extras, who had rented part of the bungalow from Gladys. Then Grace McKee, Gladys's friend and co-worker, was named the child's guardian. But McKee kept her ward for only a brief period, and Norma Jeane found herself in her first foster home with the Jiffins family before being sent to an orphanage on September 13, 1935. She spent nearly 2 years there. When she finally left the institution in June of 1937, she stayed temporarily with 2 foster families, before settling again with Grace in January or February of 1938. In her years as a starlet, Marilyn Monroe would treat her childhood like a Dickensian story involving a dozen or so foster homes, the drudgery of washing and cleaning dishes in an orphanage, sexual molestation, and even her attempted murder, when her grandmother Della tried to smother her with a pillow. These shocking tales derived from Marilyn's feeling that she had been deprived, exploited, and violated at a very early age. The normal pattern of growth had been disrupted, and she had true glee making the connections between herself and the world that children from stable families take for granted. Norma Jeane had to discover some way of building and controlling her self-image in a world that could easily wipe away her attachments to it. She turned to daydreaming and to the movies as a means of self-fortification, for she was a child who often felt lonely and wanted childhood 5 to die. As Monroe later put it, fantasizing exercised her imagination. A daydream you jump over facts as easily as a cat jumps over a fence. Daydreams provided her with an effortless, instantaneous attractiveness. I daydreamed chiefly about beauty. Daydreaming made my work easier. She dreamed of appearing naked in church for God and everyone else to see. This confession in my story seems circumspect compared to a reflection she later recorded in a private notebook, noting her strongly sexed feeling since a small child. Movies also filled in the gaps in her identity. Films made her feel more alive and more conscious, and better able to visualize the world that otherwise excluded her. There was nothing she could not follow on the screen, and nothing that could diminish the intensity of her perceptions. I loved everything that moved up there, and I didn't miss anything that happened, and there was no popcorn either. Her phrasing dramatically recaptures the child's awestruck love of human experience as magnified on film, seemingly compensating for the diminution of her own expury and outside the movie house. Grace McKee, who had worked alongside Gladys in a film laboratory at a movie studio, never lost touch with Norma Jeane and often came to her rescue. Twice divorced, and with a 1920s figure and stature that made it easy to share clothes with Gladys, Grace found the little girl adorable and apparently responded to that strongly sexed feeling, telling Norma Jeane that someday she would be a movie star. Another Jean Harlow, 1911-37. Grace, who liked the bootleg liquor available during the years of Prohibition, 1900-2033, often joined Gladys on nights out with Vari Oozmen. So it is little wonder that Harlow, who played the quintessent teal platinum blonde and good time girl in both silent films and talkies, should appeal to Grace as a desirable role model for Norma Jeane. By the early 1930s, Harlow had become a superstar. Paired in 6 films with Hollywood's premier leading man, Clark Gable, she enchanted audiences with her gift for comedy and her sexual allure, precisely the qualities that audiences would find so appealing in Monroe. Harlow's shocking death at the age of 26, just after Norma Jeane's 11th birthday, made a deep impression not only on Harlow's fans, but also on a nation of moviegoers. This shimmering platinum blonde presence, a spirited woman who held her own on the screen with seasoned leading men such as Spencer Tracy and William Powell, left a void that no other actress of her generation seemed able to fill. Grace mesmerized Norma Jeane with the promise of Hollywood stardom, a dream that countless childhood 6 young American girls would pursue in the aftermath of Harlow's death. Later, in my story, Monroe would allude to this generation of Hollywood hopefuls she eventually joined, saying of herself, "I was dreaming the hardest." Occasionally, incidents in Norma Jeane's childhood seemed to presage her later envelopment in image building, a sign that included the RKO movie studio water tower, which she could see from a large dormitory room, reminded her of the Hollywood dreams Grace had instilled in her. Norma Jeane had been on a movie lot with her mother, and that glamorous world still seemed within reach when, every week, Grace visited with gifts of lipstick and rouge, and played dress-up with the young girl. The actress later remembered the time she was returned to the orphanage after she tried to run away. She feared punishment, but instead she was greeted by the compassionate superintendent, Mrs. Dewey, who took Norma Jeane in her arms, telling her she was pretty, and powdered the child's face with a powder puff. No doubt the actress could not resist dramatizing this incident, and in another version, she went on to describe how Mrs. Dewey had her look in the mirror and observe her face, soft and alabaster smooth like her mother's. "This was the first time in my life I felt loved. No one had ever noticed my face or hair or me before," Monroe told a publicity woman at 20th Century Fox. A letter Mrs. Dewey wrote many years later to Grace clearly shows that she did take an interest in Norma Jeane and wanted to know how the child was doing. Grace proudly replied that the orphan had become a movie star. Norma Jeane was buoyant for days after the recognition scene with Mrs. Dewey, but when nothing resembling it was repeated, she began to doubt that the events had actually taken place. Like so many of her other experiences, this one was fragmentary. It seemed to lead her nowhere. She felt incomplete, as orphans and adopted children often do. She really did not know what to expect from one moment to the next, from people who did not have time for her. Since the gratification she did receive seemed equivocal, she apparently divided her personality in two. In her dreams, she was naked and unsullied, an immaculate figure. In reality, she submitted to degrading experiences, such as having to bathe in water her foster family had already used. She always came last, or so it seemed to her. Norma Jeane needed to see herself reflected in her mother's eyes and mirrored in her mother's concerns. A child who cannot find herself in her mother's face suffers from the same alienation that prevents the childhood 7 mother from truly recognizing her own child. As a result, such a child, in Alice Miller's words, would remain without a mirror, and for the rest of his life would be seeking this mirror in vain. There have been cases of such children who become mirrors to themselves. R.D. Lang describes one who actually used a mirror as a way of becoming another person to himself who could look at him from the mirror. Monroe turned toward mirrors for self-confirmation, as she mentions doing in my story, and she may have experienced the dual ID felt by others who fail to have their beings confirmed by their mothers or fathers. Such individuals consequently look for a means to make themselves seen as real live persons. Certainly. Chapter 2. Adolescence to Adulthood, 1938 to 1945. Suddenly everything opened up. By the age of 11 or 12, Norma Jeane began wearing tight clothing that accentuated her rapidly developing figure. This sexual exposure was exhilarating, and she seemed to revel in the attention of schoolboys, workers, and other people on the street. Adulation made her feel a part of things for the first time in her life. She could drop the oppressive, inhibiting sense of belonging to nobody, exchanging it for an exuberant, sensual contact with the elements of life itself. With the wind that caressed her as she zoomed along on a bike borrowed from an admiring group of boys. She felt, however, like two people, the neglected Norma Jeane and some new being who belonged to the ocean and the sky and the whole world. She grasped for the grandeur of life, even as she was riddled with anxiety about her rootlessness and failure to locate herself in a specific world. The mature Monroe reflected that her emerging sexuality was a kind of double-edged thing. It got her the attention she craved, but it also resulted in overly friendly advances. Her guardians worried about her high spirits, which could be so easily misinterpreted as hysteria. This shy girl had found a way to impress herself on others as soon as she realized just how pleased they were with her presence. But what ties would she make in a world that had suddenly become so accessible? And how could Norma Jeane handle these new companions when she had so little family, properly speaking, to guide her in her choices? Grace, now married to Doc Irwin Goddard, seems to have been the first to suggest to Norma Jeane, sometime in the early spring of 1942, the idea of marrying James Dougherty, an ailing Anna Lower, no longer able adolescents to a dull T Hood 10 to provide a home for Norma Jeane, apparently concurred with Grace's belief that the 21-year-old Dougherty would bring stability to this 15-year-old girl's life. Grace apparently saw no contradiction between marrying Norma Jeane to an eligible young man and encouraging the young woman to dream of a career in movies, even though few Who's bands were prepared to marry women who dreamed of becoming film stars. James Dougherty drove Norma Jeane to Van Nuys High School as a neighborly gesture. He would later claim that it never occurred to him to marry her, but he certainly took to the idea when Grace and others suggested it. But what about Norma Jeane? Dougherty would later claim that the early years of their marriage were happy, and initially, Norma Jeane, still very uncertain about her own place in the world, clung to Dougherty in grateful appreciation of his genial effort to be, in his words, her lover, husband, and father. She would join with him in establishing the first home of her own. They were married on June 19, 1942, just 3 weeks after her 16th birthday. In the early 1940s, a good wife took care of her husband, fed him, did the household work, and in general tried to make a pleasant and loving home. The couple settled into a small 4-room house in Van Nuys. The young wife seemed to enjoy the comfortable conventions of domesticity. This was, after all, the first time she could set some of her own terms for living. A kind and gentle Jimmy really seemed to appreciate Norma Jeane's efforts to become the model housewife. She had his meals ready for him when he returned from his work at the Lockheed aircraft plant. She appeared fresh and eager to please, cheered by her first efforts to furnish her own home. But conflicting accounts make it difficult to determine the compatibility of husband and wife. Was Norma Jeane daunted by the sexual demands of her husband, or did she more or less take this new aspect of adulthood in stride, as Dougherty insists in his memoirs? In my story, written just as the movie star Marilyn Monroe was emerging, the marriage is portrayed in dreary terms. Although the memoir's version has been challenged, a remarkable personal note the young wife wrote, perhaps late in 1943, is startling because it sounds like it issued from an older woman looking back on the early years of her marriage. My relationship with him was basically insecure from the first night I spent alone with him. She found him attractive, but unsure of his ability to please her. She wanted to feel she belonged to someone, and to follow the lead of her adolescence to adulthood 11 elders who had encouraged the marriage. A part of her wanted the marriage to work, but she also felt stifled, since she had not given up on her dreams of becoming a model and an actress. Norma Jeane's adjustment to marriage and adulthood was complicated by what she described as her introverted personality. She was shy. Norma Jeane c. 1942, adolescence to a dull T Hood 12, and found her greatest pleasure in reading. She questioned her own motives. Was she in love, or just thrilled that her husband wanted her? Like so much of what she would write throughout her life, the note she wrote about her marriage is full of self-doubt. Already, the makings of a deeply self-conscious identity are apparent. This awareness of her own weaknesses stimulated her desire to improve, even as her acknowledgement of her failings debilitated her. She had a striking grasp of the self's mixed motivations, which led her to question not only herself, but those close to her, in this case making her wonder if her husband had been unfaithful. She also knew that too much self-examination could harm her. Everyone needs a little conceit to carry them through and past the falls. This line, with its misspellings, is characteristic, and other parts of the note reflect the shaky syntax of a high school dropout. But the introspective quality of this 17-year-old is powerfully present in this 6-page document. Judging by her personal note and his memoir, Dougherty never discovered the depths of the young woman he married. He always professed amazement that his Norma Jeane metamorphosed into Marilyn Monroe. "I never knew Marilyn Monroe," he liked to say. He did not realize, however, that he never knew Norma Jeane either. Dougherty took on too much. After the United States entered the war, He was eager to participate and deferred his decision to enlist only to placate his young wife, terrified at the prospect of losing the sense of permanence marriage represented. He was there, in part, to bolster her confidence, and she may have regarded overseas duty in the Merchant Marine in early 1944 as an attack on the marriage itself. In her calmer moods, she did not resent his war service, but during emotional periods, she blamed him for wrecking their relationship. His departure seems to have been a direct blow to her sense of self-worth, to her own reason for living, so she had to find another way of surviving. As Arthur Miller observes in Time Bends, she deeply feared abandonment. Abandonment was what people did to her, sooner or later. They left. According to Doherty, the night before he was to ship out, Norma Jeane became hysterical and pleaded with him to make her pregnant, so that she would have a part of him if he did not return. She dreaded his leaving, refusing to talk about it, and in desperation announced that she planned to call her father. This was evidently the first occasion on which she tried to contact him, and she may have been trying to certify her existence in still another way. When he failed to respond to her call, to accept adolescence to adulthood 13 his paternity, she was devastated. Norma Jeane exhibited terrible anxiety about being alone. There were too many gaps in her life, and like other women of her age and troubled background, she panicked easily. She was not depressed or sad. Rather, she was out of control and absolutely at a loss when contemplating the absence of her husband's attention. She was far from inconsolable, however, and she quickly took up war work as a paint sprayer and parachute packer in an airplane factory. She wanted to feel needed and recognized. A diligent worker, she managed to cope with her husband's departure quite well. The marriage itself may have seemed less crucial to her well-being, more like an interim identity, the first substantial role in which she had invested herself. As an aircraft employee, Norma Jeane had no trouble getting noticed. On June 26, 1945, David Conover came to the factory to photograph young women engaged in war work. He found Norma Jeane fascinating. He marveled at how easily she performed for his camera over the course of 3 days. A quick study, she welcomed the new world opening up to her. She began to make suggestions about how she should be positioned for shots at various factory locations. Norma Jeane's encounter with Conover confirmed her sense of destiny, which had been dormant since those early days with Grace and conversations about Jean Harlow. From then on, no matter what her disappointments, Norma Jeane was on her way. With Conover's encouragement, a modeling and movie career seemed possible, and her commitment to Doherty diminished. She wrote him fewer letters and single-mindedly pursued her new goal. On his return, he tried to win her back, but he had very little interest in her dreams of stardom and could not identify with the success she had made of herself while he was away. Although they were not officially divorced until September 13, 1946, the marriage was surely over by late 1945, when Emmeline Snively's modeling agency employed Norma Jeane. Reflecting on her first marriage in my story, Monroe bitterly regretted years that held her back. She dismissed the significance of her feelings for Doherty, as though her real life only began with her photographed incarnation. She stressed that she had come to Hollywood after the breakup of her marriage, seeking more than fame and adulation. She came in a spirit of self-interrogation. She intended to live by herself so that, at 19, and she could find out who I was. Doherty would have kept her from even attempting this daring discovery of an identity. In 1945 and 1946, a reborn Norma Jeane mastered new images of herself the camera helped her find. Just as an infant manipulates images of adolescence to a dull T-hood 14 itself, duplicated in a mirror, could a fully realized self emerge from posing for the camera? By focusing a lens on herself, she learned to hold the world in her gaze. Perhaps the intense drama of her photographic séances could make up for the insufficiency, the dullness, of her life up to that point. Both Emmeline Snively and David Conover recall Norma Jeane's persistent scrutiny of photographic prints. She wanted to be able to recognize her mistakes and to make each shot as perfect as possible. This hard-working apprentice was far more inquisitive than Snively's other models. Norma Jeane wanted to know as much as possible about the powers of projection. André de Dianes, who photographed Norma Jeane against Var-Rieu's landscapes in early 1946, captures her ingenuous youthfulness and self-assurance. With her frizzy brown hair, uneven jawline, somewhat bulbous nose, and slightly protruding front teeth, she is hardly ready to metamorphose into Marilyn Monroe, but she gazes directly at the cam era, conveying the impression of a willing, malleable subject. Her sexual playfulness and the organic sensuousness of the scenes she is placed in the mirror-gazing Marilyn C. Late 1940s, adolescence to adulthood 15 are happily congruent. She is a pliable performer, utterly at ease whether she rests against a rustic fence railing or clings to the side of a mountain slope. Norma Jeane's work habits were admirable, punctual and well prepared for each day's shooting session. She also exhibited extraordinary resilience. Yet Diane's observed that she seemed curiously frail and that she would curl up in the front of the car and fall asleep after an assignment. It is not surprising, of course, for a performer to behave this way after the excitement of a performance, but to Diane's, Norma Jeane seemed out of focus when she did not have the camera's attention. His impressions echo what other photographers would later notice. Her hours passed in a state of dreaminess that left her oblivious of the environment, and this began to irritate him. Diane's had illusions that this young woman would fall in love with him, but she seemed bent on demonstrating her independence, dating several young men who shared her ambition to be successful in Hollywood. Bill Burnside, one of Norma Jeane's dates, remembers her liking for Shelley and Keats, and that what she most wanted from him was his education. She built up a considerable library and a small circle of friends who could help her with reading. She thought essential to the development of herself as a person and a professional actress. No man during this period excited her special devotion. Diane's photographs, like countless others she would pose for in this period, were not definitive for her. Instead, they served as her threshold to a larger world. Chapter 3. Early Career, 1945 to 1950. On August 26, 1946, after about a year of working as a professional photographer's model, Norma Jeane Doherty signed her first movie contract as Marilyn Monroe. Modeling had been a crucial step toward an acting career, but it was only a step. She posed for department stores and industrial shows, wearing a variety of clothing, ranging from sports outfits to negligées, diligently took lessons in makeup, grooming, and posing at Ms. Snively School, and appeared on the covers of several magazines. But Norma Jeane had no clear idea of how to go about learning to become an actress. Of course, she had to spend most of her time acquiring modeling skills, which to some extent propelled her toward acting, and she had to spend the rest of her time supporting herself through modeling jobs. Nevertheless, over the next 3 years, while under studio contract and taking classes in acting, dancing, and singing, she showed little promise as an actress. She had virtually no acting experience when signed to her first contract with 20th Century Fox, yet acting, she insisted in my story, was this secret in me. Something golden and beautiful, like the bright colors Norma Jeane used to see in her daydreams. It was not an art but a game about worlds so bright they made your heart leap just to think of them. Acting was her compulsion, a thing in me like a craziness that wouldn't let up. Acting would eventually become a transformative process capable of expanding the boundaries of her small and lonely being. The year before Norma Jeane signed her first studio contract, Lines snively told her, "You're very girl next doorish." Her face and figure were pleasing, sometimes provocative, but not yet compelling as perfect ear like rear 17 sexual shapes. She had to learn to smile with her upper lip drawn down in order to help minimize the length of her nose and to hide her gum line. This adjustment resulted in a wavering of her lips, first glimpsed at the end of her second scene in the asphalt jungle, and then emphasized in close-ups in Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, where her undulating lip seems to mimic the movement of her whole seductive body. So that she could adapt to a variety of modeling assignments, her hair had to be cut short, straightened, bleached honey blonde, and styled in a sophisticated upsweep. Such changes imposed a welcome redefinition of her person. Now she had a specific role to play. Yet she had not chosen this identity, and she resisted, momentarily, Hollywood's highlighting techniques. Emmeline Snively had to persuade the young woman to consider both a screen name and the physical changes that would make her a negotiable prospect in the modeling agency's dealings with the studios. Thus, a role was grafted onto her, and she had to attach herself to it, which she did by joining Monroe, Gladys's maiden name, to Marilyn, the first name posed for her at the studio by Ben Lyon, the executive in charge of new talent. Lyon had been so deeply impressed with Norma Jeane's youth and beauty that he immediately arranged for a screen test on July 17, just 5 weeks before she signed the contract he had promised her at their first meeting. She was good visual material. This was the verdict on the silent screen test, shot in color. She was directed to walk across the set, sit down, light a cigarette, put it out, go upstage, cross, look out a window, sit down, come downstage and exit. She is supposed to have looked and acted like one of those lush stars of the silent era. On screen, she paired palpable, kinetic, all fire, one witness to the test exclaims. Yet what to make of Marilyn Monroe seemed to puzzle both the AC Tress and her studio. In fact, she would not legally change her name for another 10 years. Publicity shots of the period 1946-48 reveal nothing about her intense desire to act or about what kinds of roles might suit her. The arbitrariness of the shots is most striking. Monroe is there to make the poses, fulfill the assignments in a makeup session, in a series of yoga-like exercises, in skimpy bathing suits, in low-cut evening gowns, in a potato sack, in a babysitting sequence, in an acting lesson, in tights, in sultry poses, nightgowns and t-shirts, and playing baseball. This miscellany provides no apparent unity of image, no archetypal Monroe, although her vibrancy does make some of these ephemeral shots captivating. ERLY career 18, after about 6 months of appearances as an extra, she performed a brief bit in Scuddahu. Scuddahay, editing eliminated her close-ups, and she survives only in a long shot in which her face is undistinguished early publicity shot. C. Late 1940, Early career 19 Abel. Rose Steinberg Wapner, a script assistant on several of Monroe's films, beginning with Scuddahu. Scuddahay remembered a Monroe sweetly and innocently committed to dreams of stardom. How do you become a star? She asked Wapner as the two of them traveled by car to a movie set. At 21, this starlet did not seem anything like a stunning, provocative female personality. Instead, she was like many girls, Wapner remarked, eager to fit herself into the proportions of stardom. On August 25, 1947, after a year that saw little film work, Fox canceled Monroe's contract. She continued to take acting lessons and to play a few stage roles. She did not create much of an impression in her theatrical debut at the Bliss Hayden Miniature Theater in Beverly Hills, where she appeared in Glamour Preferred from October 12 to November 2, but she was remembered for her subsequent willingness to play whatever role was assigned to her. Monroe had not yet made friends with the kind of people who could promote and guide her career, although she would start to do so in December of 1947, when she signed a personal management contract with the husband and wife Tam of John Carroll and Lucille Ryman, who would be instrumental in securing her first featured role in The Asphalt Jungle. To Carroll, an actor who bore a slight resemblance to Clark Gable, and to Ryman, who headed the talent department at MGM, Monroe seemed like the waif she specialized in impersonating. We didn't think of her as a star for MGM, Ryman recalled. Not when the studio had great bow ties like Greer Garson, Katharine Hepburn, and Lana Turner. We signed Marilyn to keep her off the streets because she was hungry, like a little kitten looking for food. Even as a model, Monroe sometimes failed to demonstrate talent. John Ingstead remembered her pose for a photoplay photograph entitled How a Star is Born. Against a background of velvet draperies, the starlet would stand in an elaborate gown with her hands outstretched with an "isn't it wonderful" expression. A reticent Monroe arrived promptly for her assignment, put up her arms, smiled, and that was that. Ingstead was impressed with her pretty face, but he could not account for what transformed this sweet young thing into the superstar and sex symbol of a generation. Indeed, her "Isn't it wonderful" photograph is lifeless. She looks like a M. Annequin, a stiff-limbed waxworks star. Posing for this photograph was not so wonderful, her lack of focused expression implies. Aimlessness pervades the whole composition. Nothing about the frozen figure sustains attention. ERLY career 20 Monroe's earlier photographs, especially those taken by Canover and Dedines, were probably successful because a certain degree of improvisation was encouraged, and she remained free to invent a repertoire of poses against informal settings that dispelled her anxieties. In the series with Canover, she performed against the background of her working life in a factory. For Dadaines, she had landscapes to which she could respond. What could she place herself against in the brief session with Ingstead? Her arms are held up in this photograph, but they lack the force of a genuine uplifting gesture. Her mechanical posture may well be related to the absence of continuity in the conditions of her employment. At this point, Monroe's first powerful mentor began to shape for her a sense of what a whole career would look like. Sometime during the end of her first year at Fox, she met Joseph M. Schenck, an executive producer and one of the founders of the studio and of the Star System. Schenck took an early interest in Monroe for her offbeat personality. In my story, she describes herself sitting around his fireplace, listening to him talk wisely about love and sex, as though he were a great explorer. His visage fascinated her. It was as much the face of a town as of a man. The whole history of Hollywood was in it. These were lean days for her, and both Schenck's food and his dinner guests fed her ambitions. She believed Schenck would secure her status at the studio, and while Fox did not keep her, Schenck persuaded Harry Cohn, head of Columbia Pictures, to sign her to a contract in March of 1948. Marilyn denied the gossip that she was Joe Schenck's girl, and that she performed sexual favors for him in return for his support of her career. She was secretive about her sex life, but several of her friends believe she used sex as a way of saying thank you to men who had helped her. In her first months at Columbia in the spring of 1948, Monroe struggled to find herself as an actress. Natasha Lydes, an acting coach, was instructed by her boss, Max Arno, to see what could be done. In Lydes's bitter and self-serving memoir, she recalls that her pupil was more than inhibited, more than cramped. She couldn't say a word freely. Single-handedly, Lydes would have readers believe she shaped Monroe into the semblance of an actress. Lydes tried to make Monroe her protégé, even taking her into her home several years later during the making of Clash by Night. As a result, the actress became increasingly dependent on her coach for advice and insisted that Lydes accompany her on movie sets. Under Lydes's supervision, Monroe would read scripts several times lie ka rear 21 and underline words that ought to be emphasized. She also marked scripts to indicate character traits or questions of interpretation she wanted to discuss with Lydes. Monroe developed a sense of deliberateness that simply would not allow her to be rushed. She began to treat her own body, her own strenuously acquired sensitivity, as instruments, a point she emphasized in her last recorded interview. Finally, with Lydes, a former student of the great Max Reinhardt, a legendary director and producer of modern theater and film, Monroe could talk over the world of ideas without sounding pretentious. On movie sets, male directors had been skeptical of her intellectual curiosity and ridiculed her reading of writers like Rilke and Tom Paine. But with Natasha, Marilyn could explore the Russian classics, the Stanislavski School of Acting, and, more generally, a world of European learning that World War II immigrants brought to Hollywood. In Fred Karger, Monroe discovered a mentor and lover to whom she could devote her passion and determination to become a star and a woman of importance. Karger, a musical coach, became an exemplar of elegant style and clear performances. My story describes him as a handsome man with a compelling smile. His compact physique perfectly complemented his neat and efficient handling of a song. Nothing was wasted on this immaculate figure, with whom Monroe quickly fell in love. Although Karger responded warmly to Monroe, introducing her to his mother and sister and frequently taking her out, he also had reservations about her curious blend of immaturity and raw ambition. He was put off by her embryonic mind, which was also inert and barely conscious of the life around her. He hurt her, but she valued his honesty and his objective appraisals. At his urging, for example, she submitted to Plaw's tick surgery and dental work that removed the imperfections visible in the Conover and Dadaines photographs. She progressed steadily under Karger's professional supervision and gradually withdrew from his equivocal courting. Karger had shown Monroe that she could work according to a rigorous, concentrated schedule and produce a convincing performance. Natasha Lydes might be preparing her for her future as a serious artist, but Karger had gotten Monroe ready in a very short period for her immediate assignment. Second lead in Ladies of the Chorus, 1948. This was her first sizable role, and she performed well. In Motion Picture Herald, Tibber Creeks noted that, one of the bright spots is Miss Monroe's singing. She is pretty, and with her pleasing voice and style, she shows prom ERLY career 22 Ladies of the Chorus, 1948. Ear Ka Rear 23 Eyes. The movie, shot in 11 days, seems to have been designed to be forgotten, for the plot, the characters, and the songs are bland and barely credible. The movie received few reviews, and Monroe was not able to impress the studio with her performance. And indeed, Columbia terminated her contract after the first 6 months. This eventuality was hardly her fault, since her role had so little room for subtlety of characterization. She plays a chorus girl, Peggy, engaged to marry a wealthy young man, Rand Brooks. She is fearful that his family will reject her as soon as it learns of her lowly show business background. Her fears are happily dissolved when her fiancé's mother, Nana Bryant, convinced Peggy loves her son, pretends in front of guests at an engagement party to have a secret show business background of her own in order to ease Peggy's entrance into high society. For Monroe, this trite movie was a manifestation of her new life. She had finally been able to follow herself across a movie screen, as she had followed so many stars in her childhood. That gloomy childhood, or at least her somber sense of her early years, was lightened by the glowing sign of her success. She had managed to have an impact on the world, at least briefly, in the enlarged brightness of her own image. No wonder she repeatedly drove past the theater featuring her film, for it was like watching the announcement of her new identity. An announcement even more exciting than the 50-foot tall skirt-flying likeness of herself. An advertisement for the 7-year itch that later appeared on the front of the State Theater building in New York City. With no more than this token of success in hand, she was forced into other work after the expiration of her Columbia contract on September 8, 1948. Dress designer Jean Louis, who worked on the film, saw nothing remarkable in Monroe. She was just a baby then. No one at Columbia pictured her potential, he told interviewer John Coble. In late August and early September, she appeared in a production of Stage Door at the Bliss Hayden Theater, and she is reported to have worked briefly as a stripper at the Mayan Theater in downtown Los Angeles. Now an actress unattached to a studio contract, she was able to land only very small roles in Love Happy and A Ticket to Tomahawk, both released in 1950. The latter, in which she has one song and dance number with Dan Daly and a few incidental appearances with 3 other dance hall girls, is almost as forgettable as Ladies of the Chorus. But the former, a Marx Brothers production with a built-in audience, features her in an extremely brief but highly visible walk-on wearing a tight, low-cut CERLY career 24 quined gown. Slinking into Groucho's office, he is playing a detective. She asks for his help. After he answers, "What can I do for you?" she saunters directly toward the camera, as in an aside he comments, "As if I didn't know." Then in mock seriousness he inquires, "What seems to be the problem?" She replies, "Well, men keep following me all the time." The scene received extraordinary attention, which the film's producer, Lester Cowan, helped generate by putting Monroe on a cross-county publicity tour. For the first time, she had been really noticed, in a film that revealed a crucial aspect of her screen persona, a curious blend of innocence and maturity. She has a puzzled, naive quality, so she is the perfect target for Groucho's wisecrack. But her voluptuous body, which sweeps across the screen with such aplomb, suggests that she knows the answer to her problem. She rests her right hand on Groucho's upper chest and leans against him. Then her fingers move slowly up his shoulder, in command of him. Her eyebrows are slightly arched, as she sways past the camera with lowered lids. Surely a woman who can handle herself in such a deliberately provocative manner is conscious of the power of her sexuality. Her saucy hips playfully belie her sweet voice. That is part of the joking nature of her appeal. Of course, there was no way to know if what Monroe could project for less than a minute could be sustained for a whole film. She was still a figure, not even a face in films, with her anonymity still intact, and with a desperate need for some ready cash, $50, to make a car payment, she consented to pose for a couple of nude calendar illustrations, shot by Tom Kelly on May 27, 1949. Like her role in Love Happy, the 2 nude poses, Golden Dreams and A New Wrinkle, emphasize her body, not her face, as a decorative item. Neither the movie nor the calendar photographs identify Marilyn Monroe. Indeed, it would be a few years before her calendar shots would make news. She escaped immediate recognition because she modeled as a type of figure popular on such calendars at the time. Yet, as in the case of Love Happy, she brought an added dimension to the type. Her pose stands out from other girly pictures of that era, like Monroe's screen test, one of the calendar shots, in which she lies across a red velvet background, became an exercise in creating striking visual effects and a composition that has been called a work of perfect symmetry. The overall picture is one of harmonious interplay between the model and her background. Her long blonde hair cascades across the flowing diagonal folds of red velvet drapery. Sexual tension is suggested ear-lie career 25 by her right hand, thrust into her hair, and a bit of coyness in her, seeming to glance back at the viewer from her twisted pose. A vivid, self-directed personality is portrayed in this photograph. Note, for example, how the model has framed her face with her right arm, tilted her head upward and to her right, opening her red lips slightly. Her upper front teeth are showing, and shifted her eyes to the right. Although girly pictures ordinarily depict passive women who expose themselves to lascivious inspection, Monroe's calendar shot seems a new wrinkle indeed. For the model is nothing if not active and in control of the sight lines in this pose. Did Monroe intend precisely these effects? Was she conscious of calm positional techniques? Her photographer, Tom Kelly, recalled that he was convinced that she had a genius for sensing what the camera saw as she posed. She worked for 2 hours without any specific coaching from Kelly. She was as graceful as an otter, turning sinuously with utter naturalness. The inhibitions Lightes had observed in the young actress vanished as soon as her clothes were removed, Kelly remembered. In my story, Monroe says the striking of joyous poses, while nude reminded her of childhood dreams and momentarily saddened her, until, after a few poses, she realized how much she liked her body. As usual, the star ties up the loose ends of her life by transforming them into an integral narrative of herself's slow emergence. Yet it is also likely that Monroe's absorption of the photographic medium was having a cumulative impact upon her, so that she could begin to gather her experience together and express it coherently. Monroe's work on Love Happy and the nude calendar suggests she was learning how to attract professional notice. She gained confidence from Carroll and Ryman, who were well connected to studio executives, and who also provided the affection and support Monroe craved. She may have had a brief affair with Carroll, and for a short period, she lived with the couple. In their company, she also met the powerful Hollywood agent, Johnny Hyde. Shortly after the release of Love Happy in March 1950, Hyde, charmed by her scene with Groucho, decided to represent her. He was the first influential professional who expressed unreserved faith in her star quality. He did not take her apart in Carger's merciless fashion. He did not follow Lightes' dictation of how an actress should carry herself, and he did not emulate Schenk's reserved counsel. Instead, he seemed to reach inside of her, as he would reach inside himself for an organic understanding. Monroe notes in my story that after her success in the Asphalt Jungle, ERLY career 26 Hyde was beaming and acting, as if he had made good on the screen, not me. Certainly she made good as his client, his discovery, but he was also happy for her, Monroe insisted. He was a deeply kind man without any selfishness in his treatment of her, because, according to Monroe, he not only knew me, he knew Norma Jeane too. He knew all the pain and all the desperate things in me. Hyde's primary contribution was to get her to see herself without always relying on the evaluation of others, to have faith in her own genius. Paradoxically, she could only sense her autonomy by imagining how great his need was for her. They became lovers, but she was not in love with him. She refused several offers of marriage from the ailing agent, even though such a union would have given her financial security. On the advice of Lucille Ryman, Hyde had convinced John Huston to test Monroe for the part of Angela in the Asphalt Jungle, 1950. The actress secluded herself with Natasha Lightes in order to explore every facet of Angela's personality and to understand her character's relationship to the film as a whole. At the audition, Monroe felt sick and had to remind herself of her years of study in preparation for her first chance at a real acting part with a great director. She doubted that she would be any good, but Huston was kind and patient and allowed her to do her lines lying on the floor to simulate Angela lounging on a couch. As soon as the scene was finished, Monroe asked to do it again. Huston said that was not necessary. He had already decided to give her the part, but he allowed her to do so anyway. This version of Monroe's breakthrough moment has been disputed. Only in retrospect, reports Donald Spoto, did Huston accord himself the distinction of spotting Marilyn's genius. In fact, he had another actress in mind. Lola Albright, sultry, stylish, beautiful, and Kirk Douglas's co-star in Champion, 1949. Lucille Ryman goes even further, rejecting Huston's story altogether, insisting that Hyde had not been able to persuade Houston to test Monroe. Ryman and her husband, she continued, confronted the director, who owed the couple a considerable sum for training and housing his horses. Carroll told Huston, who loved horses as much as he loved to spend money, that Huston's debt would be canceled in exchange for testing Monroe. "Otherwise, I'll have to sell your horses," Carroll told him. Well, Huston blew up, Ryman recalled. He said, "She gets to everybody, doesn't she?" The tactic worked, but Monroe was one of 7 actresses auditioned for the part. The next day, Monroe told Ryman that the audition had been ear-lie career 27. "Wonderful. I was good. I was awfully good. Did the director say so?" Ryman asked. "No," Marilyn admitted, but instead of making her repeat the scene several times, as he had done with the other actresses, he simply said her work was fine. She did not realize that Huston's thank you was a brush-off, Ryman said. Marilyn was so naive. Ryman then gave her version of what really happened. "I called Cotton Warburton, an editor at MGM, and I asked him if I could see the tests the next day before Huston saw them, even though the director is supposed to see the tests before anyone else. I called Mr. Mayer and got him out of a meeting. I told him it was urgent. I said, I want you to look at this film that just came up, the tests for the part of Angela we've had so much trouble casting." As he watched all the girls, he pointed to the screen and said, "There's the girl." It was Marilyn. Did Ryman ever tell Monroe this story? Ryman did not say. It is not likely that Huston ever revealed how Monroe obtained the part, for after all she did it well, and Huston had no reason for regret. However, his calm meant, "She gets to everybody, doesn't she?" is tantalizing. He seemed to be alluding to a power, a kind of political savvy Monroe employed, which made people want to help her. And perhaps Huston felt a certain frustration at being defeated by such a low-ranked actress. Was Marilyn so naive after all? And hadn't Ryman and Carroll, too, been taken in by the waif? Whatever the case, Monroe believed that Huston was sensitive to her requirements. She praised him for that. It was typical of her to ask for a retake of the scene, and her need for retakes would grow as her roles in films expanded. She kept pushing herself long after her directors and fellow actors were satisfied. The retakes had to do with her perfectionism, which was linked with her dread of incompleteness, of leaving a role unfinished. She had thought of herself as having been born a second time through her Hollywood career. That second birth had to be better. Each role had to be in some way an advance over the previous one, and impose Sybil demand to realize in Hollywood. Huston had a sense of the entirety of a production that in Monroe's experience, most directors lacked. To her, other directors seemed more concerned with photographing the scenery than the actors. Superb shots and setups, framing techniques and editing were their major interests. ERLY career 28, they wanted to please the front office, whereas Huston worked for his actors and seemed, indeed, a part of their acting. Even though she had a small role, he treated her like an important performer. Monroe shared with her fellow actors many complaints against directors. Huston was unusual because he showed her that everything an actor feels, including a bad case of nerves, contributes to the energy of a scene. She needed to know the whole script, not just her lines, he insisted. For acting was also reacting, listening to other actors, losing herself. Each piece of advice had its incremental effect, until she could see how all of it was integrated into a systematic approach to the art of film. He had objectified a process of creation for her that had been previously narrowed by her nervous preoccupation with herself, or by the constricted concerns of less talented professionals. Monroe found the role of Angela in the asphalt jungle deeply satisfying. Although she had only a few lines and 2 scenes, her character was indispensable to both the plot and the themes of the film. As in the famous calendar pose, the first shot of Angela shows her sleeping in the twisted posture, which emphasizes her enticing figure and her attention to her body, one hand entangled in her hair. She is in a position of extreme passivity and is startled by the staring face of the attorney, Emmerich, Louis Calhern, who has been her lover, but who now manifests what is to her a puzzling mixture of desire and contempt. In her sybaritic waiting upon him, she represents a significant aspect of the corrupt lifestyle he has grown to deplore, but from which he cannot seem to extricate himself. She is one of his collectibles, an extravagant example of what he calls his absurd lifestyle. Angela will lie for him and provide an alibi to cover his involvement in a jewel robbery only so long as she is under his direction. But when he fails to supply her with her cues, she is uncertain, meek, scared, and finally devastated by harsh police interrogation. When Emmerich bids her to tell the truth, she quickly offers the last bit of evidence that will convict her lover. She has her moment of anguish when she says, I tried. I'm sorry, Uncle Lon. He expected her to acquiesce to whomever controls the situation, and so he replies, you did pretty well, considering. Considering what? Considering that she did lie for him, that she was loyal to him for at least a few moments under intense police pressure. She did pretty well considering the kind of amoral, conniving creature she is. Such questions seem appropriate, given that she immediately asks him if she will still be able to go on the trip he has promised her. She knows Lai Ka-reer 29 will be going to jail, but she thinks only of herself. His answer, shaking his head, some sweet kid, ironically exposes just how self-preoccupied she is in pursuit of her happiness. She lowers her eyes and moves away to dictate her statement to the police. Is she disappointed, or is she aware that she has asked an inappropriate question? She is easily cowed by circumstances and willing to shift with the momentum of the scene. The role of Angela deserved the keen concentration Monroe gave it because it was meant to suggest one of four choices made by women in an asphalt jungle dominated by hard, brutal, and greedy men. Erich's wife, Dorothy Tree, seeks refuge in invalidism. She hopes that she will be able to ensure her husband's affection and keep him in the home. Emmerich simply installs Angela in another home. Dahl Canavan, Jean Hagen, in love with stick-up man Dix Handley, Sterling Hayden, tries to keep her man by observing strict loyalty to masculine codes of toughness, which means she refrains from overt displays of affection and from openly confessing her need for Handley lest he regard her as an obligation. He softens under her tactful care, and she discovers why he has adopted such a mean exterior. Maria Schiavelli, Teresa Celli, is the faithful housewife and mother who knows nothing about her husband's job. He, the asphalt jungle, 1950, ERLY career 30, is expert at cracking safes, and is bewildered by his sudden death in the jewel robbery, since she has been so cut off from the realities of his life. As the most beautiful of these women, Angela has room in which to maneuver and to manipulate men, but she is also undermined by her own youthful stupidity, which makes it difficult for others to take her seriously. As a very young woman, she has not yet learned how far her scheming can take her. She does not size up situations well, and, as a result, she can appear to be ridiculous, as in her response to the policeman who knocks on her locked door. Haven't you bothered me enough, you big banana head? In such a role, Monroe had to portray an unusual variety of emotions. Her character is shallow, but Angela's behavior is devious enough to allow for a full play of gestures and facial expressions. If she was acting a type, the kept woman, Monroe nevertheless was interpreting lines and script directions that gave her the opportunity to fashion a whole person. Angela had to be passive, seductive, innocent, solicitous, puzzled, vulgar, scared, angry, stupid, nearly hysterical, anguished, and calculating in just 2 brief scenes. There was plenty of room for mistakes, for missing the transitions from one emotion to another, but Monroe was flawless in her fulfillment of the script's demands. In the asphalt jungle, Monroe gave her first thoroughgoing performance, one that would finally lead to significant roles. Hadn't she shown an impressive authority as an actress, an especially important matter for one who struggled so grimly to be creative? Joseph Mankiewicz, impressed with her work, took Johnny Hyde's advice and cast her as Miss Caswell in All About Eve. Monroe welcomed another chance to work with a fine director. This small but conspicuous part presented her with the opportunity to make a vivid impression in a film sure to receive wide distribution and publicity. The role of Miss Caswell solidified Monroe's dumb blonde stereotyping. The variation on the type in this case is Miss Caswell's absence of innocence. She is hard, ambitious, and corrupt, in spite of her youthful beauty. She is less dependent on men for her cues than Angela is, although she is just as ignorant. When she fails to get a part in a stage production, she asks whether they have auditions for television. Rather than cultivating her own talent, she entertains important producers whom she hopes will help her acting career. Her understanding of success is couched in crass materialism. Seeing a fur coat she admires, she says, "Now there's something a girl could make sacrifices for." Although the character is vulgar, Monroe plays her in a fairly restrained manner, ear lie ka rear 31, with no awkward gesturing, no obvious attempt to render Miss Caswell's lack of subtlety in visual terms. Yet Monroe shows Caswell, in her first appearance in the film, always on the verge of smirking, suggesting the wanton attitude just behind her soft, beautifully displayed figure. In author words, Monroe employs a sensitive tactfulness in portraying a tactless character. The point of such restraint is to prepare for the right dramatic moment, when Miss Caswell's predatory sexuality can emerge in its most appropriate form. Monroe saves Caswell's exaggerated use of sexual innuendo for a brief scene with a producer, in which she drops her eyelids, smiles provocatively. Her lips almost pucker, and delivers a heavily suggestive thank you while lowering her voice. Monroe's 3 brief appearances in this film amounted to something less than she was given to work within the asphalt jungle, and Miss Caswell's range of emotions is constricted compared with Angela's. So it is difficult to say what a shrewd professional observer might have been able to make of Monroe's performance in November 1950, when All About Eve was released. Monroe wisely took Natasha Lyon's advice to understate the character's mannerisms. Her coach exhorted her not to act, so as not to destroy the credibility of Caswell's simple insights into people. As Fred Giles suggests, one of the best lines in the script is Caswell's perceptive description of a producer, Gregory Radoff, she is encouraged to cultivate. "Why do they always look like unhappy rabbits?" It is very easy to laugh at this blonde, and it would have been easy for Monroe to turn the character into a kind of cartoon. Instead, she endowed Caswell with a complete personality, and in doing so she contributed to our understanding of Eve, the main character in the film. Eve Ann Baxter is a sophisticated, truly successful version of Miss Caswell. Eve wants to become a star in the theater, and she does so by ingratiating herself into the lives of the most important theater people. She is adept at dissembling, at making herself indispensable to others. She is always careful to prepare for her exploitation of others, and for the sexual advances she hopes will help secure her success. She is able to fool nearly everyone, and she achieves her career goals, for she has assumed the role of acolyte to the famous actress Margot Channing, Bette Davis, telling Channing that acting has made up her life. Margot misses the irony of the statement. Not only does Eve mean she has become obsessed with the stage, and with following its stars, she also means that she is acting, making herself into a kind of character who will trample the lives of those who help her. Everything Eve does is an act. She is nothing as a person, ERLY career 32 everything as an actress. She plays the role of Margot's secretary, so she can grasp the role of the star, later insinuating herself into the role of Margot's understudy, and then seeing to it that Margot misses one of her performances. It is essential that Miss Caswell also audition for the understudy role, to show that only Eve's shrewd kind of acting can prevail. Miss Caswell lacks Eve's insight into the necessity for ubiquitous acting. In many ways, this film about the actor's personality had great relevance for Monroe's life and career. Many people in Hollywood already equated her with Angela, and then with Miss Caswell. She was given credit for skillfully playing parts according to her type, not for imaginatively exploring a type according to her talent. As in The Asphalt Jungle, she was featured as a blonde siren who could not possibly perform any of the other female roles. It would seem to be an elementary observation that an actor who performs a part well need not be just like the part she or he plays. And yet, particularly in the case of film, the person and the role often become interchangeable for both the audience and for film professionals. Vari ooze aspects of Angela, and Caswell seemed similar to aspects of Monroe. All About Eve, 1950, ear lie ka rear 33, both characters were under the protection of older men, just as Schenck and Hyde had protected Monroe. Monroe, like Miss Caswell, was viewed by some as a schemer. Nunnally Johnson, who would later write parts for Monroe, saw her as one of the eager young hustlers of Hollywood. She was Johnny Hyde's girl, not worth talking about outside Hyde's presence. Natasha Lyon's, speaking in rancor after Monroe rejected her, claims in her memoirs that her pupil found Hyde an expedient tool in her rise to stardom. Monroe acknowledged this questioning of her motivations in my story when she complained that no matter how truthfully she spoke or how honestly she behaved, most men and women believed I was trying to fool them. On others, Monroe made little impression. Celeste Holm, one of the stars of All About Eve, recalls that she saw nothing special about Monroe's Betty Boop quality. I thought she was quite sweet and terribly dumb, and my natural reaction was, whose girl is that? On a visit to the home of Dana Andrews, then one of Hollywood's leading men, Monroe, in the company of agent Charles Feldman, showed no star power at all. At the time, Andrews found her indistinguishable from the other Hollywood hopefuls he met. Later, he expressed bafflement that he detected nothing at all in her manner that presaged her fame. Two reporters for Life and Look, Stanley Flink and Rupert Allen, witnessed other sides of Monroe that reflected a young woman making the transition from obscurity to stardom. A transition that inevitably provoked conflicting responses in the subject and in her observers. Flink's memories of late 1949 or early 1950, when he first met Monroe, center on how she seemed to be caught in the swirl of Hollywood glamour and publicity. She was not absolutely sure she wanted to be an actress, but the possibilities of such a career dazzled her and seemed better than anything else she could imagine. She was quite willing to take direction. Indeed, he remembers a highly nervous young woman who seemed, whenever he visited her movie sets, quite dependent on her directors. Her peculiar combination of innocence and ambition charmed Flink much more than her appearance, which he found pleasant but not startlingly pretty. Rupert Allen, a soft-spoken, Oxford-educated American, was immediately impressed with the actress's stunning beauty and dedication to her craft, as well as to her physical fitness program. She lifted weights, a very unusual activity for a woman then. But as Lois Banner reports, on Catalina Monroe became friends with Howard Corrington, a former Olympic weightlifting champion who was in her husband's unit, and ERLY career 34, she studied weightlifting with him. Allen worked hard to prevent Look from turning his article about her into the typical celebrity piece. Instead, he wanted to impress readers with her intelligence and wit. He had no doubts about the great career she was about to begin, and he looked forward to the fulfillment of the youthful promise he detected in early 1950. In a few years, he would work for her as a press representative. They remained close friends for the rest of her life. Allen provides the best evidence of a complex performer learning how to inhabit many roles, including her assumption of injured innocence, behind which, as Lydes claims in her memoir, Monroe hid a hardened shrewdness and guile. It was always like that. When you disagreed with her, she was like a little flower in the grass, a poor thing whom no one loved. At the smallest suggestion she might be wrong, she could make you feel guilty. Lydes might as well be describing the clear-eyed sharpness of Miss Caswell that is so strikingly different from the soft, droopy-eyed vagueness of some of Monroe's later roles. The tableau shot from All About Eve that is often reproduced shows Caswell's vivid focus on Eve, as Eve aggressively focuses on the critic Addison DeWitt. This was a tough, competitive period for Monroe. As she implies in her description in my story of Hollywood parties, she would attend for purposes of self-advertising. Such behavior clearly labeled her a young woman on the make. She was much more than that, however, judging by Lydes's intriguing description of Monroe's behavior. Whenever she explained something, her right hand darted forward, weaving to the left and right like a serpent. It was a gesture of evasiveness and survival through expediency. Certainly Lydes's favorite epithet, a veiled woman, evokes a Monroe far more secretive and devious than Angela or Miss Caswell could ever hope to be. Films fused Monroe to her persona and standardized responses to her. In the theater, it might have been somewhat different for her because of the distance between the actor and the audience. The actor can increase or decrease that distance, accentuating or diminishing certain features and gestures according to the demands of the role. In film, the camera moves in and away from and around the person of the actor, creating a personality that somehow survives and transcends individual roles, and audiences gather to see how different roles reflect the same film personality. This is basically a tautological process, in the sense that films perform like mirrors, throwing back to audiences images of stars that have already been reflected in other films, mirrors. On stage there, Ir Lai Ka Rear 35 is no screen. Even a stage star does not have to contend with replica tions deposited, so to speak, onto strips of celluloid. It is easier for the stage actor to outlive earlier roles, since it is merely memories of past performances with which she must contend. Memories are also mirrors, of course, but memories fade and change. Celluloid strips, on the other hand, continually refresh reflection. In the images of her face, her figure, her voice, it was easy for Monroe to confirm the impressions of those directors who typed her as a dumb blonde. In other words, they were able to fill in their visions of what a dumb blonde was like by elaborating on those aspects of her that resembled the type. They missed the whole person, or perhaps it is more accurate to say that they were not looking for one. George Sanders recalled that Monroe's conversation had unexpected depths. She showed an interest in intellectual subjects, which was, to say the least, disconcerting. Although so much attention has been devoted to the resemblances between Monroe and the parts she played, no one has noticed that she experienced the kind of psychological pattern that would prepare her to play Eve's role. Like Eve Harrington, Marilyn Monroe desperately wanted to be a star, and she was willing to sacrifice most of her personal life to attain her goal. She had relatively few friendships other than with those people who were in positions to support her career. She moved in with people who helped her and became intimately involved in their lives, just as Eve moved in with Margot Channing and began to run her life. Monroe appeared to be kind and soft and helpless. Almost everybody on meeting her wanted to help her. Marilyn's helplessness was her greatest strength, asserts Sidney Skalski, her Hollywood columnist confidant. Similarly, Eve appears to be a naive and tender young girl who appeals to the hard-boiled, cynical theater crowd. Monroe may also have been like Eve in her ability to deceive herself, so that she would not have to admit that she had occasionally deceived others. As Lydes observed in her memoirs, she cannot face herself, she keeps her back to herself. Certainly, Monroe was like Eve in her fanatical belief that only through acting could she be a success, somebody deserving of respect. After recounting several instances of Monroe's thoughtless cruelty, Lydes reports telling her, "You knew how ill I was, and you never called. I want to love you, but you make it difficult." Monroe replied, "You don't have to love me, Natasha, as long as you will work with me." This brutal refusal to deal with her coach's feelings of betrayal reveals just how far Monroe's monomania may have taken her toward ERLY Career 36 Eve's ambitions. She may also have found it necessary to harshly separate her personal and professional feelings regarding Lydes, because of the latter's all-consuming interest in her life. Lydes never seems to have considered that Monroe had to protect herself from a mentor who tried to supervise every aspect of her life. How Monroe evaluated the sincerity of the role she played in relation to Lydes is impossible to determine. All About Eve makes this point when its characters accuse one another of playing scenes rather than express sincere emotions. To complicate matters further, actors may believe in the characters they create, just as some famous figures, including Monroe, have been suspected of believing their own publicity. Fiction that is intensely conceived, in other words, can replace fact. As Mailer puts it, "The most mysterious property of a factoid of fiction that masquerades or functions as a fact is that it is believed by the people who put together the factoid printed next to it." Perhaps Monroe's work on All About Eve made her especially conscious of Addison DeWitt's notion that actors are not like normal human beings, for they are particularly likely to believe their own fantasies. She may well have thought of herself as belonging to a separate category of human beings. Skalski points out that Monroe often quoted her own version of DeWitt's remarks. "Once in a while, somebody writes an article saying that actors and actresses are just like other people. We're not. It's because we're not that we're actors and actresses." DeWitt's view of the actor's abnormality leads him to conclude that all theatrical folk are the original displaced personalities. Certainly Monroe's own version of her life stressed her displacement, her alienation from the conventions of ordinary life. Acting was a form of compensation for her many deprivations, and the warm response of an audience, which Monroe experienced for the first time in a movie theater showing The Asphalt Jungle, replenished her identity. It is easy to imagine Monroe fervently delivering Eve's statement of commitment to acting. I've listened, from backstage, to people applaud. It's like waves of love coming over the footlights and wrapping you up. Imagine to know every night that different hundreds of people love you. They smile, their eyes shine. You've pleased them, they want you, you belong. Just that alone is worth anything. Monroe consulted Sidney Skalski, just as Eve consulted DeWitt. Monroe even used to leave messages for him signed, Miss Caswell. With Skalski acting as the crucial manager of her early publicity, she was able lie career 37 to model herself into a strikingly sympathetic and attractive personality who could compel the adoration of audiences in just the way Eve describes. In retrospect, at least, Skalski insisted on the deliberateness of Monroe's self-creation. She knew how to sell herself and had an immediate, intuitive grasp of the value of publicity. She refined stories about herself that proved colorful, carefully embellishing them to provoke even more publicity. Skalski never knew what to believe about the story of her bleak childhood, but he concluded she was not quite the poor waif she later claimed to have been. She kept increasing the number of her foster homes because she knew it was a good selling point. She had doubts about her identity, but not about how she should portray her biography. It should play like a good movie. Similarly, she was remarkably astute about her movies, and she knew far better than the studio executives what a successful Marilyn Monroe movie ought to contain, Skalski concluded. Without a definitive sense of herself, Monroe was free to engage in endless variations on her biography. Whether she was calculating or relatively unconscious about her fictionalizing or cynically performing what was expected of her is difficult to determine. Surely at one time or another, she engaged in all of these different behavioral possibilities, perhaps mixing them together in ways that cannot be distinguished. It may have become as difficult for her as it was for others to know when she was just being herself. It is impossible to describe confidently the state at which Monroe had arrived in the evolution of herself and her career in 1950. Norma Jeane, Angela, Miss Caswell, and Marilyn Monroe are some of the shifting phases of her identity. But she, what name is appropriate for her at this point, cannot be associated too closely with any of these phases. She is not as young as the Angela she played so well. Unlike Miss Caswell, she passes her audition and is praised for her talent. Marilyn Monroe, the star and the mythic figure, had not yet emerged, and Norma Jeane never really had the opportunity to develop as an adult. Clearly, Monroe was tentative about herself and elusive with others. Joseph Mankiewicz remembered her as a solitary actress, carrying around an edition of Rilke's letters to a young poet. She seemed unsure of herself, and in social gatherings of the cast after the filming of All About Eve, although she was pleased to be invited to join them. Somehow she never understood or accepted our unspoken assumption that she was one of us. She remained alone. She was not a loner. She was just plain alone. ERLY career 38 Monroe put her whole trust in only one person, Johnny Hyde. Although she had lost her first contract with Fox, he was able, on the strength of her performances in The Asphalt Jungle and All About Eve, plus very small roles in The Fireball and Right Cross, to get her another Fox screen test with the actor Richard Kant in early December. On December 10, she signed a 7-year agreement with the studio. In the minds of Joseph Mankiewicz and others, Hyde was responsible for whatever self-esteem and professional confidence Monroe could muster. Troubled by a weak heart for years, Hyde finally succumbed to his ailment on December 20, just 10 days after ensuring his client's professional future. Monroe went to pieces and, according to Leides, tried to kill herself with a pill overdose. Joseph Mankiewicz thought that Monroe never fully recovered from Hyde's death and, in fact, gave up on herself. Hyde's son remembers her at his father's funeral, where she was overcome with grief, throwing herself on the coffin. She shook everyone, screaming Hyde's name over and over again. Monroe grieved for him as if for herself. Grief did not prevent Monroe from doing her work. Although on the set of her next film, As Young as You Feel, she would weep and disappear from the set, according to her director, Harmon Jones. Just 2 weeks after Hyde's death, Elia Kazan's visit bolstered her. This group theater veteran of the 1930s, an acclaimed film and theater director of the 1940s, liked her unpretentious wit, her reliance on his advice, and her sexual attention. In Fragments, Monroe gives just a glimpse of what Kazan meant to her. He was a sounding board and comforter, holding her once through a long night of terror, a not infrequent experience for a woman whose insecurities stimulated men to want to embrace and protect her. Kazan wanted to introduce Monroe to his friend, Arthur Miller, whose work Kazan had directed on the stage. Kazan had brought the playwright to Hollywood to work on an original screenplay they hoped would be produced. Later that same week, Miller and Monroe met at a party given by Charles Feldman, an important Hollywood agent and producer. Monroe and Miller became involved in an intense conversation about their lives and literature, although there were relatively few contacts between them until she moved to New York City nearly 6 years later. It was already clear to Natasha Lydes that Monroe began almost immediately to console herself with the idea of someday joining with this celebrated playwright in establishing the career and identity that Johnny Hyde had promised her. Irlai Ka-rear 39 in Time Bends, Miller reveals that Monroe's hopes were not misplaced. In fact, her impact was overpowering. She represented to him a seductive free spirit and imagination itself. She was capable of living in the moment with a joy he had never encountered. Just before their departure, they visited a bookshop where she picked up a volume of E.A. Cummings's poetry and amused herself with his celebrated poem, In Just, which celebrates the puddle wonderful world of spring. Monroe walked out of the bookstore, practically singing the poem's refrain and slash it spring. Miller fled Hollywood, realizing not doing so would result in his being drawn into Monroe's irresistible orbit at a time when he still yearned to rejuvenate his moribund marriage. Miller's testimony is the best evidence of how magnetic Monroe had become, even before her first starring roles. Miller, not one of the jaded Hollywood crowd, thought better of her than she thought of herself. He did not make a pass at her. She took this restraint as a sign of respect, but he admitted in his memoirs that a mixture of fear and moral misgivings prevented him from acting on his desires. Nevertheless, she was for him, as she would become for millions of men, fantasy made flesh. And Miller, no match for the power of this fantasy, faded away, no more equipped to deal with this eruption in his middle-class life than Richard Sherman is when he meets the girl, the very embodiment of his desire, in The 7-Year Itch. Chapter 4. Becoming a Star, 1950-52. And I want to say that the people, if I am a star. They made me a star. No studio, no person, but the people did. On January 1, 1951, Marilyn Monroe made her first appearance on the cover of Life magazine. Throughout the next 2 years, her popularity grew steadily, yet she was given parts that were usually brief and undistinguished versions of what her studio biography called the Blowtorch Blonde. Stories about her in Life, Look, Collier's, The American Weekly, Photoplay, and Modern Screen noted her serious pursuit of acting, but the career Hyde had carefully charted seemed about to lose its direction because of her studio's lack of imagination. To Robert Kahn in Collier's, she appeared to be the standard Hollywood blonde with a vague smile that seems to include everybody. Life wondered if she could really achieve the universal sex appeal of Jean Harlow. Monroe was not taken seriously, perhaps because her photographs and films appeared to be self-contained. They did not put the question, "Who am I?" that Monroe herself wanted to address. Instead of showing her as the half-finished, fragmented personality she said she was, the photographs often portrayed her in a partially aroused state that stimulated the viewer imaginatively to elaborate on her erotic provocations. A typical publicity pose displays her with half-closed eyes and half-open mouth. For neither seeing nor speaking, her potential intellectual attributes and capacities are meant to form part of her appeal. Parts of her body, the darkened lips, the long black eyelashes, the smoothly shaped and elongated eyebrows, are heavily outlined, and other parts, her neck and torso, are ringed with jewelry and clothing that accentuate the roundedness and fullness of her figure. The luminous makeup, the bee echoing a star 41 lustrous jewelry, the self-encompassing use of her hands, and the bent-forward attitude of her head and upper body fashion, a fully equipped and seductive self-image that contradicts the cryptic off-camera self Monroe was trying to fathom and to define. Photographs and films projected a dazzling array of Marilyns, an enormously passionate display of a person who wanted to believe that she was a remarkable individual, who wanted to see and hear how she looked and sounded to others. But her replications were, in a sense, all pretense. She was producing shadows of selves and not living out her life in her own way, unless she was willing to have her own way dictated by the studio. Like many creative persons, she wanted to reinvent herself, to give birth to herself in her own image. If Kennedy Fraser is right that women get accustomed to chopped-up images, eyes, nose, and mouth in a powder compact, the back of the head in the hand mirror, the feet and ankles in the sloping glass at the shoe store, then imagine how Monroe became accustomed to polishing parts of her reflected image, so that she was deflected from the deeper sense of self she claimed to be seeking. It was not enough for her to recognize herself in her mirrored image, she said. Although this is literally one of the few forms of self-recognition she was allowed in most of the films she worked on from 1950 to 1952. In Right Cross and The Fireball, released in October and November 1950, respectively, she plays sexy blondes in roles that gave her no opportunity to develop complete characterizations. Her sexy blonde secretary role in Hometown Story, May 1951, is no better. And it is not until her performance in As Young as You Feel, June 1951, that she made an impression on the critics. She is a secretary to a corporate executive, Albert Decker, and as usual her sexual appeal is emphasized. The camera holds on her wiggling walk down a hallway, she takes shorthand in a low-cut dress, and she is prominently featured as a kind of decoration in her boss's office. She's given just a little more to work with in this role, and she is on screen long enough to suggest an alert attentiveness which is quite different from the attitudes of the giddy blondes of some of her later films. Her lines are almost all brief, monosyllabic replies to her boss, yet there is a scene in which she is pictured as very deliberately attending to herself, looking into two mirrors, smoothing her face and dress, arranging her hair, and sticking out her tongue, offering the first direct view of the self-involved figure who emerges in later films. It is my business to be sexy, that's the way I define myself, Monroe seems to be saying. Becoming a Star 42 Love Nest immediately followed As Young as You Feel in October 1951, and it makes clever use of her developing screen persona as a woman with such formidable sexual appeal to men that she belongs in a category all her own. Monroe plays an ex-WSC, Roberta Stevens, the friend of Jim Scott, William Lundigan, a veteran recently returned home to his wife, Connie June Haver, who has just purchased a building in New York City as a means of supplementing their income. With her first appearance, Monroe's character is set up as the kind of provocative female that other women suspect. Connie eyes Roberta suspiciously, even though Roberta behaves quite properly and dresses formally in a business suit and veil. When Jim comes out to meet his old friend, he has offered to rent her a room. He is somewhat ruffled by his wife's insinuations and perhaps overwhelmed by the impact Roberta has made before she even enters his home. He trips over himself as he follows her up the steps. Monroe plays Roberta as a confident, outgoing model who is mildly amused by Jim's friend, Ed Jack Parr, who makes enthusiastic passes at her. She laughs at him tolerantly. Just as the girl Monroe plays in The 7-Year Itch good-naturedly accepts her male companion's sexual gambits. In both cases, Monroe's characters imply a certain degree of sexual knowledge that is never revealed. The quick shots or scenes in which Monroe appears throughout the rest of Love Nest excite curiosity about her and convey a personality that never gets fully expressed on the screen in brief glimpses of her in a bathing suit, taking off her nylons, undressing to reveal a silky slip and lacy bra, and wrapped in a towel getting into the shower, then coming out in a bathrobe, smiling seductively at Jim. June Haver's recollections of working on Love Nest provide a fascinating insight into how Monroe regarded herself in the first stages of her stardom. More importantly, Haver touches on the sources of Monroe's universal appeal: her vulnerability, her quick and confident response to an appreciative audience, and her way of eliciting an elemental reaction in others who enjoyed just watching her effortless movements. Monroe was a shy and nervous actress, and she seemed very young and pretty to Haver. She had an electric something, especially noticeable in a scene where she was supposed to be sunning in the backyard of the apartment house we all lived in. The entire crew seemed stunned by Monroe's appearance in a bathing suit and stared silently as she walked across the set. Work stopped. Haver had never seen a film crew so impressed, and she marveled at their attention to Monroe, since they were used to seeing becoming a Star 43 actresses in brief costumes, in musicals and beach scenes. There might be some playful flirtation with actresses, but never this kind of complete devotion. Haver could tell that Monroe loved their reaction, and in her shy way, she smiled. Having an audience gave Monroe confidence and made it easier for her to deliver dialogue that was always difficult to get out, just on the first word or two. Haver observes. Not only did Monroe have to overcome a stammer that dated back to childhood and adolescence, when she could not bring herself to audition for school plays, she believed her hesitations on movie sets would make people think I'm no good. As she wrote in a note to herself, she dreaded ridicule, especially outright laughter that would belittle her. The very thought of such rejection made her depressed and angry. Her only antidote to such troubling thoughts was to think of the times when she had performed well and of moments that were excellent. When Monroe relaxed and warmed up, she suddenly seemed to be another person, as if she had gone through a complete metamorphosis. She became completely uninhibited in her movements, the way she sat in that chair, so gracefully, naturally graceful, and seductive at the same time. Suddenly, she seemed to shine like the sun, Haver concludes. But this naturally graceful actress worked hard at seeming spontaneous and unself-conscious. Writing in her notebook, in separate lines, this mantra, "No attitude listening to the body, for the feeling listen with the eyes." Haver's tender reminiscence is similar to what other women felt on the set of Love Nest. And it suggests that Monroe could charm both sexes, in spite of all that has been written about her appeal to men. In such moments, she attained the goal for which she and Natasha Lyonne had striven: freedom of self. Movie sets were difficult places for Monroe to practice self-expression, for making movies is often a dull, repetitive, and frustrating business. Scenes are shot over and over again, with checks for lighting, makeup, sound, changes in script, various camera adjustments, and so on. An actress wonders exactly when the crew will really be prepared. When she be becoming a star, 44 should give all of her effort to a scene. Filmmaking is guided by rhythms of mechanization, of industry, not by actors' rhythms. Since movies are rarely shot in sequence, there are few opportunities to build toward climaxes that are rehearsed in stage plays. In spite of these obstacles, Monroe continued to give energetic, humorous, and fully committed performances in forgettable films. For example, in Let's Make It Legal, November 1951, her physical appeal, "She is a beautiful blonde who trades on her looks to get what she wants," is gratuitously used at the beginning, middle, and end of the movie. In 1951 and 1952, she compelled the attention of audiences by honestly playing every bit part as if it really mattered, as it probably did to her, since making movies had become the objective of her life. Such an extraordinary expenditure of creative energy on insignificant roles may very well have damaged her, in the sense that she became less and less able to cope with the fragmentations of her self-filmmaking fostered. What was left of Marilyn Monroe, once her screen selves were discounted? Very little. She felt terribly dumb about many of the things people discussed: painting, music, books, history, geography, sports, and politics. She decided to go to school and enrolled in extension courses at the University of California, Los Angeles. She studied Renaissance art and literature and Freud and other psychologists. And though she did not pursue a degree, she learned enough to see just how superficial her studio upbringing had been. In her class notes, she commented on the politics of art, the way a pope could fund certain kinds of art, and the controlling role of the Medicis. Artists then, as in her own time, struggled with patrons and employers. She also read Machiavelli, who could only have reinforced her determination to be as calculating as the Hollywood princes she worked for. Through a friend, Jack Palance, Monroe made contact in the fall of 1951 with Michael Chekhov, who, along with Lee Strasberg, should be regarded as the major influence on her mature acting style. Palance had suffered from his own inadequacies as an actor and from a cadaverous appearance, and so Monroe, worried over her own professional weaknesses and physical typing, seems to have been prepared to listen fully to his confident recommendation of Chekhov's acting class. Monroe revered her acting teacher, a descendant of the playwright Anton Chekhov. She called him Russia's best actor and a brilliant man. He was selfless and saint-like and witty, too, and a heroic figure to be compared with her beloved Abraham Lincoln. In several Hollywood movies becoming a star 45, he established himself as a premier character actor, and then he retired to write, to garden, and to teach. From him, she learned more than acting. "I learned psychology, history, and the good manners of art taste," Working with Chekhov gave her a sense of tradition. She felt like a carefully chosen and honored disciple. His virtuosity, particularly his ability to play a range of roles, naturally appealed to an actress whose work had been so depressingly limited. Doing a scene with him was more exciting than acting on movie sets, for acting became for the first time an art that belonged to the actor, not to the director or producer. Chekhov had an extremely powerful idea of the actor as a disciplined interpreter of life, rather than as an imitator. He encouraged the same blending of intellectual and aesthetic interests Monroe had been trying to achieve on her own. His book asks the actor to imagine himself into the psychology of persons from other periods of history and from different nations, and of persons around him toward whom he feels unsympathetic. Chekhov adopts both an aesthetic and a moral stance toward acting when he speaks of making the body sensitive, noble, and flexible. As Monroe continued to chafe against an inflexible studio system, she was laboring at a set of exercises designed by Chekhov to produce sensations of freedom and increase life. She learned a very concrete way to open and close the self. After a preliminary series of wide, broad but simple movements, using a maximum of space, so that the whole body was involved and utilized, there followed an enactment of what might be called Chekhov's organic enrichment of the actor's sensations. Open yourself completely, spreading wide your arms, hands, your legs far apart. Remain in this expanded position for a few seconds. Imagine that you are becoming larger and larger. Come back to the original position. Repeat the same movement several times. Keep in mind the aim of the exercise, saying to yourself, I am going to awaken the sleeping muscles of my body. I am going to revivify and use them. Now close yourself by crossing your arms upon your chest, putting your hands on your shoulders. Kneel on one or both knees, bending your head low. Imagine that you are becoming smaller and smaller, curling up, contracting as though you wanted to disappear bodily within yourself, and that the space around you is shrinking. Another set of your muscles will be awakened by this contracting movement. Be becoming a star 46 as part of the same exercise. The actor is to resume a standing position and then employ various thrusting, stretching, throwing, lifting, holding, dragging, pushing, and tossing movements, all of them intended to help him know his body and its capabilities. Command of the space in which the actor works is a way of exerting control over environment. Gradually, as her film roles from Don't Bother to Knock to The Misfits demonstrate, Monroe would find ways to inhabit more fully the frames of her films and go beyond her early intuitions about proper positioning in the frame. In Chekhov's view, the actor is a sculptor, a shaper and molder of movement and space, and there are concrete exercises that demonstrate how he can create himself as a movable form. The fingers and hands are trained separately to combat vagueness and shapelessness. There can be nothing amorphous, aimless, or accidental about the actor's movements. Similarly, his sense of hearing has to be sharpened through deliberate exercise, so that in every sense of the word, the actor becomes a finely tuned instrument. Much of what Chekhov covers about interpreting a role Monroe would have already learned from Laides, but perhaps his emphasis on the autonomy of the actor was new to her. Chekhov directs actors to work on imagery associated with their characters, and with images of fantasy, in order to develop imaginative flexibility. He explores in considerable depth the process of perfecting a character's dominant psychological gesture, and he combines his initial physical exercises with certain psychological themes the exercises explore. He then progresses to the principles underlying the composition of a good performance and the structures of plays. At every step, his aim is to broaden the actor's sense of responsibility and insight. Chekhov stresses the organic relationship between life and art. His view is that the same laws of composition govern the universe, the life of earth and man, and all of the arts. As a corroboration of his insight, he recommended that Monroe study Mabel Ellsworth Todd's The Thinking Body, which became, Monroe later told her friend Ralph Roberts, her Bible. No look/body only, she wrote in a notebook. She would take years to absorb the thinking body, and she never claimed to understand all of its technical information, but she practiced many of its exercises and was influenced by Todd's way of siru, aiding the body within the continuum of human psychology and physiology. In early 1952, Monroe's work with Chekhov, and indeed her very ka be becoming a star 47 rear, seemed in jeopardy when journalist Elaine Mosby announced she was about to break the story that the actress had posed for nude calendar photographs that appeared in gas stations, barber shops, and other places where men congregated, participating in a culture that catered to soft pornographic depictions of disrobed females. This was still a period in which the stage striptease was popular, and burlesque theaters thrived. Ever since the introduction of the Hollywood Production Code in 1934, the movie industry had carefully censored the images and the language of sex, so that nothing approaching the explicitness of strippers like Gypsy Rose Lee could be shown on screen. There was, of course, a lively underground economy involving pornographic movies for men, but no legitimate actress would dare to appear in such work. It has long been rumored that Monroe made what used to be called girly films, but no one has produced an authentic example. Marilyn Monroe was in trouble. Daryl Zanuck summoned her to a meeting with Harry Brand, head of publicity at 20th Century Fox, the man who perfected sanitized studio biographies of stars emphasizing their wholesomeness. Zanuck warned Monroe that if Mosby published her story, the actress's career might be over. Studios always included a morals clause in contracts, giving employers the power to rid themselves of players who offended the public's standard of decency. Marilyn's first reaction was to believe she had destroyed her chance at fame. Opinion divided on what she should do. Some studio executives expected her to deny the story, reasoning that her partially obscured face left the identity of the poser in doubt. But Harry Brand had watched how well Monroe had worked with the press, and her confidant, gossip columnist Sydney Skalski, urged her to get ahead of the story by giving Mosby an exclusive interview. Monroe opted for the straightforward approach, telling Mosby she had done nothing wrong and was not ashamed of her work for what she called an art calendar. As an aspiring actress, she needed the money, and the photographer's wife had been present for the photo shoot. That wasn't a terrible thing to do, was it? She asked the sympathetic reporter. Treating the scandal as a surprise, Monroe said she had not expected anyone to recognize her. And then she took the journalist into her confidence. "They say it will ruin my career. They want me to deny it's me." The actress's lack of shame about her work and her defense of it as artistic won the admiration and sympathy of millions of fans. The public was on her side. Later, she would joke when asked about what she had on during her calendar poses. "Just the radio," she replied. Becoming a star, 48 biographers have treated the calendar controversy as a key moment in Monroe's ascent to stardom, and they have lauded her deft handling of the press. They have not, however, paid enough attention to the shifts in American culture that made Monroe's candor possible. The calendar kerfuffle had been anticipated 20 years earlier, in 1931, when Gypsy Rose Lee was arrested after the premiere performance of her striptease act at the Republic Theater on 42nd Street in New York City. "My baby is innocent and pure," her mother told the New York Evening Graphic. "I wasn't naked," Gypsy said. "I was completely covered by a blue spotlight." Even the detectives who arrested her said that Gypsy had not committed an obscene act. Telegrams offered to protect her as if she was a virgin in distress, biographer Rachel S.H. Dare reports. One tabloid quoted Gypsy as explaining that she made the detective wait outside while she dressed. Since the early 1940s, Lee had made the striptease not merely popular entertainment, but also a witty art, writes S.H. Dare. No less than Eleanor Roosevelt offered this tribute to Lee. "May your bare ass always be shin-ing." Like Lee, Monroe emphasized both her youthful innocence and her seriousness as an artist, and also like Lee, Monroe liked to talk about her avid reading of serious literature. Lee, in other words, set the precedent for transforming what had been considered a crude and demeaning kind of low entertainment into an aesthetic form of self-revelation. Monroe won the public by saying exactly the right thing. "They want me to deny it's me." That a new magazine, Playboy, used one of Kelly's nude photographs on its cover consolidated her national appeal. Just a few days later, Monroe agreed to Sydney Skalski's idea to announce in his column her blind date with Joe DiMaggio. Not only did this story bury any lingering blowback about the nude calendar, it elevated her into the pantheon of American heroes. DiMaggio, considered one of baseball's greatest players, had just retired from the game. His record of getting at least one hit in 56 consecutive games is an achievement that no other player has ever surpassed. Barbara Leeming does not exaggerate when she writes that DiMaggio was idolized and revered. Graceful on the field, at 37 he was trim, tall, and an elegant dresser. Fastidious and taciturn, he amused Monroe, who is supposed to have asked how he contrived to get the polka dot exactly in the middle of his tie knot. He was circumspect and reminded Monroe of a business executive. If they did not seem to have much in common, the sexual attraction between them momentarily overrode any qualms they had about one another. Becoming a star 49, the couple had probably met, at least briefly, a few years earlier. And though she was no sports fan, it is hard to believe Monroe's later claim she had not known DiMaggio was a famous baseball player. David March, a mutual friend, had arranged the first date precisely because DiMaggio was a legend, one who had his eye on Monroe when he had seen a picture of her with another baseball player, Gus Zernial. Encouraged by DiMaggio's interest and powerful presence, Monroe began dating him. He seemed to fit the cliché of the strong, silent type. That he did not open up easily, though, seemed to entice Monroe, who was used to glib Hollywood men who were show-offs and manipulators. DiMaggio believed he was the one to steady her, as she managed her way to the top in Hollywood. He was a tough negotiator and gave Monroe sound career advice, but ultimately he wanted her to quit show business, believing that being Mrs. Joe DiMaggio should be enough for any woman, even Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn Monroe, however, was just beginning the major phase of her fame. Then, yet another journalist seemed to undermine the carefully aged account of her ascent to stardom. A Los Angeles Daily News reporter with Joe DiMaggio, c. 1954, becoming a star 50, was set to publish a story about Gladys that would contradict the account of Norma Jeane, the orphan that Marilyn had carefully nurtured. Monroe had let reporters think that her mother was dead, rather than have to explain the sordid details of Gladys's biography. How would the public react when it learned that Marilyn's mother was alive? Repeating what she had done with Elaine Mosby, Marilyn called the Daily News reporter, Erskine Johnson, and gave him an exclusive interview. She released a statement that cleverly implied that not disclosing the truth about Gladys had been a way of protecting her mother's privacy, not an effort to hide inconvenient facts. "My close friends know that my mother is alive," she began, and then reiterated the sad tale of her times in foster homes and in an orphanage. Gladys, an invalid, had been sent to a state institution while her daughter was still a child, making it difficult for her young daughter to maintain any significant contact. But Marilyn had been supporting her and would always be available to help. As with the calendar scandal, the public found Marilyn's version of her victimhood endearing. As Mailer suggests, she broke through some kind of publicity barrier in this year, so that everything she did was made to seem interesting. The various views of Marilyn Monroe in 1952 and 1953 in popular circulation and fan magazines, in Time, Newsweek, and in the daily newspapers, were nearly all generous. Most reviews of her film acting were approving or tolerant, and beginning with Clash by Night, June 1952, a few reviewers began to credit her with acting skill. Unfortunately, her films were not carefully assessed, and most viewers did not see her versatility. In Clash by Night, she is forceful as a working-class woman, Peggy, who does not feel the urgent need to defer to men, to seduce them, or to complete her life by marriage. She is not a liberated woman by today's standards, but she plays her part with a vigor that is directly attributable to her independent stance, to her awareness of male domination, not just natural vivacity. She is a convincing worker as she plunges her hands into an assortment of fish, a tense, determined expression on her mouth. The film still of this scene, which does not appear in the film's final cut, is a study in the concentration of human labor uncharacteristic of most of Monroe's other roles. Yet there is nothing about her aggressiveness that diminishes her sexual attractiveness. Indeed, a study of the different postures she assumes in this movie suggests an upright, bold personality who can also be sensitive and affectionate with women as well as men. The film exemplifies director Fritz Lang's abiding concern with the dark side of American life. It stars Barbara Stanwyck as a woman becoming a star 51, hosted by years of fending for herself, who is tempted by the sense of security that marriage to dependable Jerry D'Amato, Paul Douglas, will provide. She nonetheless has an affair with Earl Pfeiffer, Robert Ryan, a more intense, if rather sadistic man. Ultimately, Mee breaks the hold Earl has on her to partner with Jerry, the safer man. Although the film capitulates to a post-war ideology that mandates Mee's subordination to Jerry, who is a strong and kind, if somewhat dull man, Clash by Night nevertheless examines with some sharpness the generation of women who grew up in the war and young women like Peggy, who admires Mee's moxie, even though Peggy also accommodates herself to her boyfriend, Joe Keith Andes. Dressed in jeans, which Monroe liked to wear off-screen, Peggy is nothing like the glamour figure of the actress's later films. She does not walk or talk like Marilyn Monroe. More than any other film in the Monroe canon, Clash by Night demonstrates her down-to-earth sensibility, which had to be suppressed in order to be rendered palatable to post-war sensibilities, and to her studio's desire to manufacture a fantasy of femininity that appealed to the broadest possible audience. In this respect, poster Clash by Night, 1952, becoming a star 52, the decision to build up Marilyn Monroe was a political move by a studio seeking to turn this actress into a brand that could be exploited in film after film. Monroe's mantra for this film could have been, "Keep it real." By this point, she was already getting the full treatment as an emerging star, much to the disgust of Paul Douglas, who did not see why a supporting actor should get so much press attention. Others, like Barbara Stanwyck, took a more sympathetic view. A thorough professional, Stanwyck understood the young actress's desire to get her part right even as her publicity tended to overwhelm any consideration of her talent. Monroe herself tried to come to the set with an ally, Natasha Lydes. Lang Tal irrated Lydes until he discovered that she was interfering with his own direction. Arriving late and requiring innumerable retakes of her scenes was becoming a pattern with Marilyn Monroe. She did not trust herself or others, but her reliance on Lydes was not quite what directors and studio executives supposed it to be. They regarded Lydes as a kind of guru who treated her pupil as an acolyte. When Monroe requested Lydes's presence on the set of Don't Bother to Knock, studio head Daryl Zanuck replied that it was impractical and impossible. Sideline coaching would be a disaster for her director, Roy Baker, whose creative ideas would be undermined. Zanuck expressed his confidence that she could play the part and concluded, "You have built up a Svengali, and if you are going to progress and become as important talent-wise as you have publicity-wise, then you must destroy this Svengali before it destroys you." Zanuck's attitude is understandable. How could a movie production company funk Tion if actors brought their own staff, which would serve as a kind of alternative authority to the director? But to Monroe, Lydes was a mirror, an ally, a piece of armor she wanted on her side as the studio stamped out its version of what Marilyn Monroe was supposed to be. Monroe had her own ideas for roles that she tested out with Lydes, who operated as an advisor, not a dictator, even if the acting coach did try to dominate Monroe. On all sides, Monroe engaged in a power struggle to determine what her screen identity should be. She was desperate to retain some measure of control over both her talent and her image. To be sure, a more confident actress like Barbara Stanwyck could take care of herself, but Stanwyck, who had had to pay her dues and take roles that were beneath her, becoming a star 53, surely understood the demeaning conditions of the contract player who was supposed to do as she was told. Surrendering to the studio system paralleled the national mood of conformity to conventional standards of behavior. In We're Not Married, July 1952, Monroe had a role that is much closer to the conventions established by Let's Make It Legal, where she is rated in bathing suits and other costumery of sex. In We're Not Married, she is a beauty contest winner who is referred to as that cute little girl. It ought to be easy to condescend to Monroe as the simple-minded housewife whose ambitions hinge on her looks, yet she plays the role with a verve and lack of pretension that make it difficult to dismiss her as simply giddy. Forsaking the sultry posing of her publicity shots, she projects a down-to-earth determination and ambition to be the best, even when that means inconveniencing her husband, David Wayne, by shifting the burdens of housekeeping and child-raising to him. All the same, the film typifies the unreal movieland environment that enveloped Monroe, for the housewife dimension of the beauty she plays is never presented. Furthermore, it is impossible to locate her character in a specific locale, even though she is explicitly identified as coming from Mississippi. Of course, none of the characters in the film speaks in regional dialect, yet Monroe suffered more than most actors and actresses from the distortions of movie-making typified by homogenization of language. So often, her roles centered on her figure, her presence, as if what she said, or what she was as a whole person, could not possibly be as interesting or as impressive as her body. 20th Century Fox, still, did not know precisely what to do with Marilyn Monroe until a proper vehicle for her stardom could be contrived. She had yet another opportunity to show off her talent in a starring role that called for a textured performance in a film that was not a major release. Zanuck seemed to regard Don't Bother to Knock, August 1952, as a way of seasoning Monroe before her huge buildup in the year to fall low. Her work in The Asphalt Jungle, All About Eve, and Clash by Night had received favorable reviews, but could she carry a whole film on her own? Initially, Zanuck had insisted Monroe take a screen test for Don't Bother to Knock to confirm her suitability for the role of Nell Forbes, a young woman recently released from a mental institution. Traumatized by her fiancé's wartime death in a plane crash, Nell has a grasp on reality that is tenuous at best. As she shifts deliriously between past and present, becoming a Star 54, confusing an airline pilot, she meets in a hotel room with her dead lover. Monroe found preparing for the test an ordeal, although her work with Laitis secured Zanuck's approval. Barbara Leeming reports that Zanuck thought Monroe's own unstable ID heightened her performance of a mentally disturbed character. She had told stories about how she had thrown herself on Johnny Hyde's coffin in a hysterical scene that suggested she could not come to terms with his death. Other rumors alleged that she had exhausted Hyde with her needs and was sexually dangerous and not a little mad. It seems improbable that a shrewd businessman like Zanuck would put a production at risk because his leading actress shared some of her character's mental defects. But Don't Bother to Knock emerged out of a post-war period, during which certain psychiatrists promulgated the idea that women deprived of the conventional support of husbands and families were prone to deviant behavior. Such women had trouble adjusting to normal life because they had no man they could serve. Without a healthy, happy home, the post-war family was in crisis, argued William Menninger in Psychiatry in a Troubled World. Yesterday's War and Today's Challenge, 1948. In Modern Women, The Lost Sex, 1947, Ferdinand Lundberg, a sociologist, and Marinia Farnham, a psychoanalyst, characterized women without strong male protectors as neurotic and maladjusted. In Don't Bother to Knock, Monroe had trouble playing Nell Forbes mostly because the role was poorly written. Unlike the vigorous working-class character in Clash by Night, Nell is a retiring, waifish introvert. She has a dreamy, unfocused look about her eyes and a rather listless, passive expression about her lips that make her seem blank, out of touch with others. Her primary means of expression is her hands. She grips her thin jewels together at about waist level as if she is holding herself together. At first, the gripping gesture seems normal and casual, or at most a nervous habit occasioned by her first meeting with the Joneses, for whom she will babysit. But later, when her suicidal tendencies become evident, when the camera tilts down to her scarred wrists, it becomes clear that all along she has been trying to get a grip on herself. It is through her hands that Monroe develops what Chekhov calls the psychological or archetypal gesture, conveying the essence of a personality, which serves as an original model for all possible gestures of the same kind. Monroe plays Nell as an unobtrusive person who is on the edge of insanity, but as Manny Farber points out, Monroe lulls you into always believing the girl is more normal than she is. Becoming a Star 55 as soon as Nell is alone, she gazes into the mirror while trying on Mrs. Jones's perfume, jewelry, and attractive evening dress. She admires herself in the mirror and suddenly begins to create a whole scene out of her glorious transformation. She behaves as Mischief. The Charlotte Armstrong story on which the film was based suggests like some movie star. There is something perfectly fresh about the way Nell works her metamorphosis. She does so in the wondering manner of a child, and her apprehensive clutching of her hands gives way to much more forthright hand motions as she deliberately composes herself in the mirror and loses her inhibitions. She really comes alive when Jed Towers, Richard Widmark, who is staying in a hotel room directly across from her, spots her through the open blind of her room dancing with herself. After some hesitation, she invites him over, and in response to his admiring glances, she says, "You like the way I look." It is the first time that the familiar Monroe appears, with her undulating lips and provocatively lowered voice. She gazes in the mirror as she tells Towers the story of his life, for she has confused him with her lover, a flyer like Towers, who died in the war. She kisses Towers passionately in her desperate attempt to make him her former lover, and with dreamy eyes and lowered lids, she briefly recites the sad details of her abused childhood. Monroe takes her character through several changes of mood, and makes her transitions from lethargy to seductiveness to sadness to desperation compelling. Nell is so self-absorbed, so intent on incorporating Jed into her fantasy life, the only world over which she has control, that she turns murderously on the child she is babysitting, almost pushing it out of a window. Jed stops her. When the youngster interrupts the dream of personal fulfillment Nell has tried to consummate. Similarly, she strikes her uncle, Elisha Cook, Jr., the elevator operator who has got her the babysitting job and who apprehensively checks in on her because he violates the make-believe atmosphere of her hotel room. When Nell is finally subdued after having again brought herself to the point of suicide, she subsides into the self-effacing mood that characterized her at the beginning of the film. Except that now she seems to have been momentarily shocked into recognizing her debilitating tendency to merge her fantasies with reality. Manny Farber calls Nell a small-town Alice in the wonderland of the Franklin Hotel, an apt phrase, for it captures the way the character is mesmerized by fantasies of her own adventures in front of a mirror. Jed can be anything she likes, so long as she looks at him in the mirror. Jed is becoming a star 56 nothing to her as a three-dimensional figure, but he is everything to her as a screen on which she can project her dreams. At first, she pretends the hotel room is hers. She makes up a story about why she is there. She even projects the glamorous personality she has created for herself into the future when she talks to him about a trip to South America. But her perceptions of the present and the future tend to be ungrounded, disconnected, and fragmented, just like the flat, distorted surface impressions of a mirror, which supply only the illusion of depth. Nell is a frustrating character to read because there is no sure way to connect with her. She don't bother to knock, 1952, becoming a star 57 is not lucid enough to invite explorations of her personality. A few more details about her past would clarify the source of her personality disorder, but such details would not explain her person. While Roy Baker's direction and Monroe's acting are good, Daniel Teradash's screenplay deflects attention from Nell by having Jed Conv neatly rescue her from another suicide attempt and gently enforce for her the distinction between illusion and reality. Such an ending does more to show how Jed the wise guy has learned to be compassionate than it does to show how Nell will cope, or fail to do so, with her inveterate need to transform her cryptic life into the dream of a whole self. Monroe told Hedda Roston that Don't Bother to Knock was one of her favorite films. She believed that in it, she had given one of her strongest performances. Anne Bancroft, who played a character reacting to Nell's breakdown, said of Monroe's acting in this part, "It was so real," I responded. "I really reacted to her. She moved me so that tears came into my eyes." Believe me, such moments happened rarely, if ever again, in the early things I was doing out there. Richard Widmark was less impressed with Monroe's talent, but he conceded her powerful screen impact. In many ways, Don't Bother to Knock became a test case for her, a show of strength in which she had to prove she could create a major dramatic character. Seen in retrospect, David Robinson remarks, her performance is far from being her least impressive, and it raises pertinent questions about her reactions to a role which appeared to correspond painfully to her own biography. She shared Nell's waif-like attitude, her dreamy mirror gazing, her desire to be glamorous and to dominate her environment by means of that glamour, and her generally fragmented sense of the world and human relationships. On the set of We're Not Married, screenwriter Nunnally Johnson observed Monroe's own diffidence and remoteness, the impression she created that she was not all there. Most of Monroe's other films from this period merely referred to her own character, breaking it into sexual segments. With no narrative links between the segments, she just appeared and radiated, as if the integument of her person covered everything it was essential to know about her. Thus, Henry's Full House and Monkey Business, both released in September 1952, feature her as a showpiece. In the former, she is seen briefly as a streetwalker who is surprised when a gentleman, Charles Laughton, in the street treats her with respect. "He called me a lady?" she exclaims in wonder, almost in disbelief, as if to indicate what a poor becoming a star 58 opinion she has of herself. There is perhaps just a hint of plaintiveness in her reaction that can be read autobiographically, since Monroe always sought respect but seemed startled to receive it. But the film's intention is to display rather than probe her personality, so it is impossible to say exactly what the person-to-role relationship is in this instance. Don't Bother to Knock is an aberration in Monroe's career, although the studio capitalized on her sexual appeal by having her appear in a revealing negligee during romantic scenes with Widmark. Even more than Clash by Night, Don't Bother to Knock disrupts the benign presentation of her as a life-enhancing and carefree archetype of American optimism. In Monkey Business, on the other hand, the person is completely subordinated to the role. Monroe plays Miss Laurel, a comically stupid secretary whose special skill is swinging her hips. She never really seems to understand what is going on around her, but because of her buxom figure, accentuated by a bra that thrusts her breasts forward and upward, her competence does not matter. As her boss, Oxley Charles Coburn, says, "Anyone can type." She is allowed an earnest line in which she offers to type for her employer, but he explains that his letter is important, and clearly Miss Laurel belongs to the unimportant side of business. She comes to the office early, she says, because Oxley has been complaining about her punctuation. She is asked to check all of the Ford dealers in town and find Dr. Fulton Cary Grant, the inventor of a youth serum, who has gone off on a joy ride after taking his own serum. She asks, "Which should I do first?" Throughout the film, Monroe is photographed and regarded strictly in terms of her sexual parts. She begins this splitting up of herself by ostentatiously raising her dress part way up her thigh and offering one of her nylon-clad legs for Dr. Fulton's close inspection, since he has invented a new kind of acetate stocking. The scene is positioned so that Dr. Fulton is sitting on a couch and Miss Laurel is standing above him. Naturally, he has to look up her leg, as she smiles encouragingly down at him. Later, there is a scene with Fulton in a car lot in which there is a cutaway shot to a pair of legs, and Fulton naturally says, "Hello, Miss Laurel," his greeting followed by a shot of her face, still missing her torso. The effect of this shooting style is to dismember Monroe, and to concentrate on her gorgeous face, her slim legs, her rounded behind, or her full breasts. When Oxley catches Fulton gazing at Miss Laurel's leg, Fulton replies that he has been looking at her acetates. This vulgar way of punning on her anatomy continues with other innuendos. When Fulton becoming a star 59 jumps in alongside Miss Laurel in his sports car, she asks, "Is your motor running?" He replies, "Is yours?" During the sports car sequence, in which Fulton recklessly maneuvers his way through innumerable near accidents, Miss Laurel laughs spontaneously and actually seems to enjoy the danger. She acts like an adolescent. She's taken no youth serum, and Monkey Business, 1952, becoming a star 60 is flattered by Fulton's attraction to her. In spite of her obvious interest in him, she never attempts anything like a mature seduction. Indeed, she is the only character in the film who is doomed to be perpetually adolescent, and as such she is the proper target of those adults who momentarily abandon their sense of decorum after swallowing the serum. So Fulton's wife, Edwina Ginger Rogers, shoots Miss Laurel twice in the behind with a slingshot. Again, this scene is arranged to give maximum exposure to Monroe's body, for Miss Laurel has to twist her torso twice to slap Oxley's face, and then Fulton's. She thinks the two men on each side of her have pinched her. Later, Oxley, intoxicated with youth serum, chases her and shoots seltzer water at her behind. Monkey Business was the first film since Love Happy to make deliberate sport of Monroe's figure, largely because its director, Howard Hawks, actually believed the actress was goddamn dumb. The Asphalt Jungle and All About Eve treat her with some humor, but Monkey Business stands alone in its exploitation of every opportunity to amuse itself at her expense. As in the case of Love Nest, Monkey Business spreads what is actually a very small role over several brief sequences, so that the character Monroe plays heightens interest in the film as a whole. In Love Nest, Monroe's character has an adult attractiveness. However, in Monkey Business, she is portrayed with a cuteness that is on the level with that of the monkeys featured in the film. Monkey Business was a substantial success, and it suggested that Monroe would be good in comedies. She had a sprightly, daffy, perfectly timed insouciance. The breezy sports car sequence shows that much, and she was already a star, not so much because of the movies she had made, as because of the images she was able to impress on the public's consciousness. As a representation of sexual provender, she had arrived. In my story, Monroe recalls that success arrived in a rush and surprised studio executives. But not her, since she had carefully noted how much publicity her bit parts generated. In her last recorded interview, she acknowledged how strenuously and shrewdly she had worked for public acclaim, yet she wondered if she could carry the load of adulation, if perhaps she had tricked herself into believing she could be greater than she actually was. Thank you for listening to Blur. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share for more immersive audiobooks.